Chapter 578. Hundreds of soldiers stood silently in the pouring rain. The rainwater stirred up a layer of dense mist on the dark tower shields. The long spears emitting a cold metallic light extended forward one after another, silently forming a steel forest on the square of evergreen trees. The captain of the 7th Swordsman Brigade of Amberlight's Coast Guards, Sir Malloser, finally let out a sigh of relief. He tried his best not to think about the pale faces under the steel helmets and the crooked formation. In any case, they had finished setting up the defense within the estimated time. He turned around and gave a knight's salute to the young man behind him. "General, it's done." Owen stared at the gloomy sky above the harbor. The Black Blade Squad and the Holy Cathedral's Air Force stationed in Amberlight did not have the upper hand. Their opponents were too strong. The Southern Legion had always had the strongest dragon cavalry in Erewhon, but such a force was easily abandoned by the kingdom in another period of history. He could not see that future, but now the two armies fighting in the sky above Amberlight were the same kingdom's two armies. Perhaps they should have gone for more valuable victories, to face Cruz and Madara, to face more glorious opponents. He retracted his gaze and looked at the line of defense that took more than half an hour to build. He could not help but shake his head. Such a line of defense was like a thin piece of paper in front of the White Lion Legion. It would be torn apart by the wind and rain. But after all, this was the wealthiest area in the kingdom. The soldiers here did not have to face Cruz's people in the north, nor did they have to fight the undead of Madara. Their opponents were not barbarians, nor were they mountain people. It was already good enough that they could achieve this. This was the kingdom's second-rate army. Owen was also aware of this fact. He nodded expressionlessly. Yes. Sir Malloser secretly wiped the sweat off his forehead. He was glad that he had passed the test. In fact, he did not think much of it. The royal faction was not stupid. Why would they come to the north and walk into a trap? But the opponent was an officer of the White Lion Legion. It was common knowledge that any noble commander in the White Lion Legion was a prominent figure in the kingdom, or an outstanding descendant of a big family. The young man in front of him was probably the latter. He could not afford to offend these people. Owen saw Malloser's nonchalant expression, and his disdain for him deepened. They were all shallow people. He raised his head and looked in front of him. On the other side of the curtain of rain was the last force of the royal faction. What kind of army was the royal faction's students? I hope he won't disappoint me. Owen was eager to give it a try. Amidst the rain, Amberlight was still dark, but it was almost dawn. Durak, Mare, Ken 4th years, gather here. The young officer on the warhorse raised the black war flag high, like a totem standing in the wind and rain. The young people from the royally non-commissioned official academy quickly separated into groups. Their movements were uniform and well-trained. In the pouring rain, there was only the sound of footsteps and the occasional clash between scabbards and leather boots. Ahead of them, they passed through the continuous line of rain. The scouts and cavaliers were intertwining with each other as they sent back information. "Captain Knight, we have encountered an unknown enemy ahead. They're blocking our way." In the wind and rain, the knight pointed behind him. "There's one in all 3 directions. Continue scouting. Extend to the left and right." Maynard replied coldly. She pulled on the reins of her horse. Brando, who was beside her, also pulled on the reins. Both of their war horses immediately stopped. Brando looked ahead. Raindrops slid down his pale forehead like water droplets on a statue. He raised his hand and drew a line in front of him. "This army is spreading out from Lion Street, Hawkfens into Silversmith Bridge. There are 2 platoons of more than 500 people in front. They don't have any reserves, so they're probably not a regular army." Before he finished his sentence, a voice came from afar. "Look carefully. The emblem of the Black Spider. It's the Northern Barbarians' private army. The Hellion family is Rodu's private army. These clowns want a piece of the pie." Oberway, who was behind Maynard, couldn't help but snort coldly. Everyone's eyes focused on Brando. "How do you know?" Maynard turned her head. Her wet hair stuck to her jade-like forehead. Her body was as straight as a sword in the heavy rain. Her expression was cold and indifferent. Her eyes were dark and full of suspicion. But all of this was to cover up the slight trembling caused by the pain. Brando did not answer. He just stood still on the horse. Suddenly there was a rustling sound in the rain. The dense sky-blue spiders turned from translucent to visible to the naked eye. They moved forward from behind along the road. Brando and his horse stood in the middle of this blue sea. The sea current submerged their 4 hooves. Wind spirit spiders, so many. There were many knowledgeable nobles in the crowd. They recognized the spiders at a glance and couldn't help but exclaim. "Shut up and keep quiet." Mok, one of the three knight, couldn't help but scold. He was a young man with short gray hair. His eyebrows were very short, like two caterpillars. When he frowned he looked funny and cute. Freya and Breton at the side couldn't help but smile. The girl in the blue uniform raised her head and looked at Brando in admiration. Behind her, the Knight of the Lake silently rode on his horse and looked at Brando. Maynold's dark eyes showed a trace of surprise. She seemed to have sensed something and asked, "You use them to investigate?" "I can only give simple orders to determine the position of the enemy in front." "But..." Brando looked at the rain and shook his head disdainfully. "I'm too familiar with the tricks of those guys." "Yes, compared to the future Madara, it's really not worth mentioning." Brando closed his eyes. The Iron Horse Glacier of the past seemed to be in front of him. The army of the undead rushed towards him, and behind him was the abyss of fire. There was no way out. "Is that so? If you were the commander, what are you going to do now?" Oberwei, the Wolf Knight, was already dressed in military attire. He pulled out his sword and asked as if they were chatting. The lone wolf turned his head. Griffin let Brando take charge of the current situation, but in fact the command of the Royal Knight Academy was still in his hands. The middle-aged man's sunken eyes were filled with a pair of firm eyes. It was easy to feel the power contained in them. "We don't have time to tangle with these rascals." Brando opened his eyes. "There are many two-faced guys around. We have to completely dispel their thoughts." "Kill the chicken to warn the monkey," Oberwei smiled. "It seems that you have a lot of confidence in these young people." Brando looked back. He saw more than 200 young men and women. The night uniforms of these young people were already soaked, and their hair was wet, but only their eyes were still shining. "I have confidence in people with ideals," Brando replied. Of course he only said it with a strong sense of righteousness. If there was no history as a witness, Brando would not be so arrogant. But he knew that he had to convince Oberwei, the actual teacher of Her Royal Highness, and also the pillar of the princess's party. The lone wolf of the kingdom showed a look of appreciation. He turned back and silently looked at the young people behind him. Most of these young people were personally selected by him from all over the country. For example, Freya, Breton, and some from the most loyal families of the royal family. Although they were the descendants of some small noble families, they were often the most outstanding and had the most firm beliefs. Young people like Moke were the representatives of these young people. These young people were the last hope of the kingdom. The first batch of students of the Royal Knight Academy. "Listen to my orders," Oberwei suddenly shouted. His voice spread far and wide with the wind and rain. Brando suddenly laughed in his heart. "From now on, you will follow Knight Brendel and fight your way out of the encirclement until Her Highness is safe." Oberwei said coldly, "Do you understand?" There was complete silence. Everyone's eyes suddenly focused on Brando. If there was anyone who had the highest prestige in the hearts of these young people, it would definitely be Her Royal Highness. Next was Maynold. In fact, Maynold had always been their commander. Almost no one dared to oppose the majesty of this female knight. After that, there were a few outstanding people in the first batch, especially Breton and Moke. After Freya obtained the Lionheart sword, her strength and prestige gradually stood out, but most people still regarded her as the assistant of the first two. As for Brando, perhaps before this day, they had never even heard of the existence of such a person. If it was someone like Makarov or Oberwei who was the leader of the royal faction or a veteran general in the army, they might be able to convince the masses. However, Brando was only in his early 20s. It seemed that he was at most the son of a noble. What qualifications did he have to command them? Perhaps he had shown some of his skills before, but that was just a summoner trick. It was nothing in this battlefield. Since ancient times, a strong army had its own pride. Even though these youths had not seen the real big picture, they were still outstanding among their peers. Even if they did not dare to directly disobey the order, no one dared to make a sound at this moment. They only waited for Brendel to make a decision. Freya immediately became nervous. Breton glanced at Brando but did not express his opinion. The young man called Moke also stared coldly at Brando like the rest. Brando did not express his opinion. Instead he directly gave an order. He spurred his horse forward, then turned back and coldly ordered, "The people blocking the princess's path are just chickens and dogs. Your mission now is to teach them an unforgettable lesson. But we don't have much time, so you only have a short period of time to learn this lesson." Learn this lesson? Everyone was stunned for a moment, then an uproar broke out. The young officers of the Royal Knight Academy were stunned for a moment before they understood this sentence. This guy actually meant to teach them a lesson. What a big tone. Cavalry assault. Let's not talk about whether this guy had the ability to teach them a lesson. The problem was, did he even have such a cavalry by his side? The competitive spirit of the young people was stirred up. Everyone looked at Brando with amusement, as if they were waiting to see how this empty commander would conjure up a cavalry to teach them a lesson. Brando never spoke nonsense. He turned his horse around and unsheathed Haurangaya. He proudly shouted, "Who is willing to be the vanguard, come to my side." There was silence. Only Freya was the first to step forward. She held her sword with one hand, her knuckles turning white. For a moment, she felt as if she had returned to the night when she escaped from Fortress Reeden. It was almost the same situation and they fought side by side. It was a miracle that only he could create. Two people. Breton hesitated for a moment, then also stepped forward. "Brando, what the hell are you doing?" He could not help but ask in a low voice. Brando glanced at him but did not answer. The sound of a horse's neigh seemed to come from the heavens, and the rain continued to fall. Blazing white dots of light appeared from the darkness and gathered little by little. Amidst the white light, Medusa held a spear in one hand, and slowly walked out of the void to Brendel's side. Next was Scarlet, a red-haired girl holding a halberd. Although it was no longer the spear of lightning, it could not hide her aura. Another gold ranker under the age of 20. The princess and her teacher silently looked at each other. The Shire smiled. As a mage's attendant, he naturally had to stand together with his knight. He lightly patted his horse, and the horse seemed to understand him and docilely came to Brando's side. Next was Mephistopheles and Andrique. The vampire's daughter stood out from the rest. She wore a long cloak, and in her hands was no longer the pair of blood-sculpted scimitars she usually used. Instead, it was a spear that surged with the power of blood. The two of them stood side by side. Next was the mercenaries of Lopez. When the Nightsong Tiger and the others appeared, they caused quite a stir. The mercenaries of Lopez's reputation was not only in Brando's memory, but also in the whole continent. Their attire was so strange that they attracted everyone's attention. This is impossible. He has the mercenaries of Lopez under his command. Legend has it that the mercenaries of Lopez never leave Fanzan to fight. What is this guy's background? 1 elemental awakener, 5 gold rankers and more than 10 silver rankers. Although the number of people did not exceed 30, when these people gathered around Brando, everyone gasped. This was an army. Not to mention the others, even Princess Griffin could not help but be startled. Although I have heard of it, I still did not expect him to have so many talented people under his command. She could not help but sigh in a low voice. But he still stands with you, Your Highness. Oberway replied. That is because of his knight's qualities. The princess sighed. But I, the royal family of Corvado, do I deserve such honor? Oberway did not answer. That's a silver elf. A scream came from the crowd. Medusa had silver hair, silver eyes and skin as white as snow. Most importantly, the dazzling scale armor on her body was like a work of art. It was exactly like the armor of the legendary Silver Elves. The Silver Elves are back. Are my eyes playing tricks on me? Everyone was stunned. Legend has it that the Silver Elves went into seclusion after a prophecy. They claimed that until the day the 4 holy cathedrals fulfilled the Holy Covenant, they would fight alongside the Black Elves again. But the Holy War was imminent, and the day when the 4 holy cathedrals fulfilled the Holy Covenant seemed to be far away. Only Oberway could see that Medusa was different. It's a heroic spirit. The princess nodded gently. His knight had gathered around him. No one could laugh anymore. The strength of Brando's side was enough to make him a king. Everyone understood this. He raised the long sword in his hand, Haurangaya, and the black blade vibrated slightly as it pierced through the rain. Listen carefully. Don't let me see anyone fall behind. Or else I'm afraid you will fail. The sword fell and the sound of horse hooves thundered. P.S. I went out today and I got home in the afternoon, so I'm a little late. This should be the last chapter of the Book of Wrath. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 579. The ripples created by a single drop of water could spread across the entire pond like a spider web. It was the same on land. Rodu watched with satisfaction as his private soldiers spread out in the rain along the Silversmith River. Although their movements were slow, their formation was messy, and the nobles' private soldiers were shouting and pushing each other in the rain, they were able to set up a line of defense a quarter of an hour faster than he had expected. Veterans who have been on the battlefield are indeed different, the Baron thought as he sat on horseback, completely ignoring the fact that their previous opponents were just unarmed peasants and so-called thugs. Under the heavy rain, a few soldiers under the lead of a knight kicked open the door of a house and chased the owner out. They then occupied the house as their base of operations. The windows of the house were broken one by one, and the soldiers were rummaging through the cabinets in search of valuable spoils of war. Their actions were quickly copied by the others, and for a moment, the cries of women and children filled the air. Baron Rodu watched coldly from the side. In his eyes, an army was like a beast, and a beast had to bare its fangs and bare its claws. This was the morale of an army, and without morale, how could they fight a war? Rodu thought that he was an experienced soldier, and when he saw his private soldiers using their fists to teach those dejected men a lesson, not only did he not stop them, he even felt satisfied. How could these thugs have the courage to resist? They had to be taught a lesson so that they would obey obediently. The sound of crying could be heard in the rain. The knight gathered around the Baron and said loudly, "I think the princess is just a little girl who blindly trusts the people around her. I think the royal faction is also up to no good, giving her 200 students. I'm afraid she's going to have a hard time." "Yes, my lord, this time will show her what a real war is like." The knight echoed in unison, laughing in the rain. Seeing the morale of the soldiers working, Rodu nodded in satisfaction. He raised a bag high and shouted, "Everyone work harder. Whoever captures the princess will be able to take this bag of gold from my hands." His voice spread far and wide along the riverbank. Bess looked disdainfully at the enemy on the other side of the river through the brass spyglass. She frowned at Rodu's duck-like voice. Ever since she was young, she had always been like a man. When she grew up, Bess really picked up the romantic side of a man and became a soldier of the kingdom. Not only that, she also became the most outstanding scout officer of the Royal Knight Academy. She put down her binoculars and stood as straight as a javelin on the horse. The thundering hooves seemed to want to merge with her. One after another, the horses and the knight leaped past her. Bess felt like she was in the middle of a torrent, and her companions were calling out the names of the knights. "Ken Mare. Iman. Keel, remember to bring my share. Eden for Erwin. For Erwin, advance." Every young knight who passed by was shouting and shrieking. There was not a trace of fear on the young faces under the pointed helmets. There was only an indomitable yearning to move forward. An excitement. Bess silently looked at the front of the line. It was already a torrent. At the furthest end of the curtain of rain, swallowtail flags had been lowered one by one, like dominoes. She could almost hear the cold command, "Level the pike! Level the pike!" "How unlucky," she spat. She looked back, only to see the smiling face of her companion. "What, do you regret it, Bess?" "Regret? Of course not." Bess replied contemptuously, "They're just chickens and dogs. If only it was the White Lion Legion in front. We're stronger than them." "The princess's safety is more important, Bess. Your thoughts are too dangerous." "Of course I know." In the heavy rain, Rodu raised his money bag high, waiting for his subordinates to cheer. Unfortunately, he did not get a response for a long time. The silence in the heavy rain was a little strange. "What's wrong?" He looked back in shock. Everyone was listening attentively. On the long street, the crisp sound of hooves could be heard amidst the rain. 1, 2, as if the hour hand was spinning faster, the sound was clear and powerful. Then, a storm, the hooves of the horses were lifted up and down by hundreds of thousands. They were uniform and gradually gathered into a force that shook people's hearts. A rapid drumbeat penetrated everyone's eardrums. It was as loud as thunder. The Silversmith River was just a small ditch in the city of Ampere-Seal. A rainstorm would cause it to overflow over the low and flat embankment. At this moment, everyone was looking at the water. The surface of the water trembled as if it was milk in a cup on the table. The surface of the Silversmith River trembled slightly. Until a pike cut through the curtain of rain. The shining tip of the pike was like a silver shuttle, and all the raindrops flew out from both sides of it. A man and a horse, their silver hair flying, their snow-white cloaks like flags, painted with pure lilies, as if they were still shining on the battlefield 1,000 years ago. On the other side of the river, the noble's private soldier who was holding a family captive had this thought in his mind. He was even completely stunned, and could only open his mouth wide as he watched the tip of the pike in his field of vision grow bigger and bigger. In an instant, as if time had frozen, it suddenly resumed its flow. With a squelch, the pike directly pierced through the soldier's open mouth and into his brain. The tip of the pike pierced through his throat, and then the huge impact completely shattered his skull, causing his facial features to distort. The fear in his eyes also distorted together, and after showing the greatest tension, his skin tore apart with a whoosh, revealing the bright red flesh and blood below. Blood spurted out, but the pike continued to move forward, lifting half of the skull, and continued forward with the bright red flag. The soldier who lost half of his head twitched and then fell to the ground softly. Blood splattered in the wind and rain, and a few sprayed on the captives at the side. The family of 3 was completely stunned where they were. Medisha swept past them with a cold face, like a silver light. A few drops of blood fell on the face of the silver elf princess, and it was a little cold and piercing, but she did not even blink. According to the age of humans, she was only 15 years old this year, but she had experienced thousands of wars long ago. It was the most tragic war since the year of the Holy Saints, and countless familiar people died in it. Life and death became passers-by and only fighting became instinct. This was the battle skill of the Silver Elves. Enemy attack. It's the cavalry. The shrill cry was like a sharp ear-piercing alarm that resounded through the river bank. Everyone seemed to wake up from a dream, and it seemed that the enemy was not as weak as they imagined. Baron Rodu's face was pale, and he suddenly had a bad premonition in his heart. He looked back and the knight looked at each other. When had they ever seen such a rider? Medisha raised her pike high. In the wind and rain, the flag fluttered. There was a loud bang as if a barrier was broken behind her. The curtain of rain in front of everyone shattered like a glass wall, and the rainwater turned into pieces of glass and suddenly moved forward. After that, a huge army of knights seemed to break out of a box. Black military uniforms, black armor, black war horses, a black torrent. Long live! Long live! The knights shouted, and the real warriors were not stingy with their blood. Although Medisha was just a little girl, she temporarily had the demeanor of a real knight, and at this moment she became a goddess in everyone's heart. The goddess of war. Stop them. On the other side of the river, a noble knight finally reacted, and almost shouted himself hoarse, set up your pikes, or you're dead. The noble's private soldiers on the other side of the river seemed to have just come to life, and only then did they hurriedly set up their pikes. Perhaps it was their survival instinct that stimulated their last bit of potential, or perhaps it was the shallow Silversmith River that comforted them, but no matter what, at the last moment, these insignificant third-rate soldiers actually calmed down. A forest of pikes appeared on the other side of the river. Medisha ignored it and only raised her pike. Wings of Spirit. A clear shout resounded throughout the battlefield. A circle of magic circle unfolded on both sides of the girl, and as the magic circle spun, the spiritual lines expanded along the circle, and quickly connected into one. Asterisk whoosh asterisk a pair of wings that were hundreds of feet long spread out, and with a gentle flap of the wings, the Silversmith River in front of Medisha seemed to be injected with some kind of magic, and the white waves in the river immediately rolled back, and the waves formed a 12-headed hydra that raised its head high, and like a tsunami, it pressed down on Baron Rodu's private soldiers on the other side of the river. Ah! Baron Rodu was stunned, and for a moment he did not even know if he should give the order to defend or retreat. He had some mediocre wizards under his command, but at this level their usefulness was meaningless. The noble's private soldiers could only watch as the giant wave came crashing down on them. Asterisk boom. Asterisk the giant wave instantly broke the formation of the noble's private soldiers on the other side of the river. In fact, before the giant wave formed, they had already begun to waver, but how could they move faster than the wave? Most of the noble's private soldiers had just turned around when they were swept into the river like garbage. Then, the flood brought the screaming noble's private soldiers head-on into the houses on the other side of the Silversmith River. After a few loud creaking sounds, the houses collapsed and flowed into the streets behind them. Baron Rodu's line of defense collapsed in an instant. Behind the giant wave, the young knight walked on the waves. They were facing a line of defense that was constantly retreating, and the pikemen had already fallen forward and backward, unable to fight back. One side was retreating while the other side was accelerating, and then the two lines of defense crashed into each other. It was like the scene of a comb combing one's hair. The young knights of the princess penetrated the formation of the noble's private soldiers almost without any hindrance, leaving behind a line of defense that was riddled with holes like a sieve. However, wave after wave of attacks, the psychological defense of the noble's private soldiers completely collapsed in an instant. They could only turn around and run. But the merciless cavalry continued to advance. The young cadets were driving the enemy away to prevent them from regrouping. Even though it was meaningless against the private soldiers of the nobles, the young cadets still followed the strict rules of the cavalry as if they were textbook standards. As far as the eye could see, Luodu's private soldiers were fleeing in all directions like ants under a collapsing dam. The sky was slowly turning bright. Brando pursed his lips as he looked at the scene in front of him, but there was no trace of satisfaction on his face. He suddenly tightened his grip on the reins of his horse, and both man and horse turned around. After standing still, he raised Haurangaya high up and pointed it to the side. Breton, blow the horn. Have the entire army split up. Brando, what are you trying to do? Breton almost jumped up. Wasn't this the time to chase away the enemy? But he immediately became speechless. He stared blankly at the sky-blue spiders that appeared once again. But this time they were not on the ground but in the sky behind Brando. One by one, tens of thousands of wind spirit spiders appeared in the sky above the battlefield, like a dense, sky-blue net. There was a moment of silence on the battlefield. Brando turned around. Brando, you. Breton swallowed a mouthful of saliva. Freya was also stunned. It was not the first time she saw these spiders, but it was the first time she saw Brando commanding so many spiders. Listen to my orders. Brando's voice suddenly echoed throughout the battlefield. Knights of the Royal Knight Academy, continue to attack from the flanks and continue to advance. Advance! Advance! After a moment of silence, there was a tsunami of cheers and roars. After Baron Rodu was dragged out of the water, he stared blankly at his knight. That knight was shouting at him, but strangely he could not hear a single word. But finally the sound seemed to have returned to his senses. He gradually heard his subordinate shouting something to him. My lord, they are splitting up. What's splitting up? Those knight are splitting up. Rodu was startled, but his face lost its last trace of color. Those bastards are herding us together. They intend to drive us forward. They intend to use us as cannon fodder, my lord. My lord, the coast guards behind us have been discovered by them. The mournful cries seemed to be far away in Baron Rodu's ears. He stood up shakily and stammered, we can't let this happen. In, help me get on the horse. We have to think of a way to regroup or we will die. But he could not finish his sentence. He suddenly saw a spear protruding from the chest of his subordinate knight. He looked up and saw the red-haired female knight riding on the warhorse, her long ponytail fluttering in the wind. That was the last thing Baron Rodu saw. Then everything fell into a cold darkness. Scarlet wiped the blood off her cheeks and turned back. Her cold amber eyes only showed a little warmth when she saw that figure. On the battlefield at the same time, almost the exact same scene was playing out in many places. Rodu's knights obviously understood their final fate, but there were still some who tried to resist. But just as these knights were about to gather the people around them, a dazzling golden light fell from the sky. In an instant it pierced through his body. On the battlefield the golden light crisscrossed. Rodu is finished. They have discovered the army of Sir Owen and Sir Malloser. Our princess is not simple. The white-haired but still hale and hearty old man turned around with a smile. He was wearing the most traditional military uniform of Erewhon, with a variety of medals hanging on his chest, and the most dazzling one was the candlelight medal of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Leiter Dullo, deputy commander of the White Lion Legion, and also the most senior knight in the White Lion Legion. In the eyes of Cruz he was Erewhon's most respected enemy, and the true pillar of the White Lion Legion, the Lion of Erewhon. When he became famous, Sly Fox and Lone Wolf were still children. He was loyal to the royal family of Covardo, neither the royal family nor the northern nobles. He was a mainstay of the royal family's power. But in this civil war, in order to repay the kindness of the royal family's eldest son, he stood on the side of the northern nobles without hesitation. Even so, no one dared to disrespect him, not even the players back then. This old man became famous in the Holy War, and since then he had been the spiritual pillar of Erewhon's army. His loyalty to the kingdom was no less than anyone else's. But at this moment the old man shook his head and looked at the other two people in the room. He smiled and said, "It's embarrassing that we old men have to bully a little girl." Marquis Balta smiled awkwardly. He certainly knew what the old man meant. "Don't worry, Knight Leiter, we will ensure the safety of the princess and the little prince." Although he was the commander of the legion, he couldn't be tough in front of this old man. The old man glanced at him. "But I'm more concerned about how they discovered the coast guards." Marquis Balta quickly changed the subject. "I'm not sure, but their scouts shouldn't have been able to get here. Although Rodu is an idiot, he has hundreds of men blocking the Silversmith River. It's not like he can't even keep an eye on a living person." The old knight touched his chin. "The other party should have made a judgment. It's not impossible to find them through clues." Her Royal Highness has grown amazingly under the guidance of that little wolf. In all of Erewhon, probably only this old knight dared to call Oberwe a little wolf. Balta couldn't help but smile bitterly. The royal family's eldest son is not inferior under the guidance of the old man. This time the old knight nodded without hesitation. While the two were talking, the guest beside them who hadn't spoken all this time suddenly stood up. "Hey, what's that?" "This is the heaven's armor." In the wind and rain, in the direction of the Silversmith River, golden light was intertwined. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 580. The collapse of Baron Rodu's army was accelerating. The students of the Royal Knight Academy were driving hundreds of defeated soldiers forward. The 7th Swordsman Brigade of the Coast Guards at the front line of the Evergreen Square was the first to bear the pressure. The terrified nobles' private soldiers had no choice but to pass through their positions, as if they were grasping at straws for survival. The Coast Guards even had a fierce confrontation with the fleeing soldiers. Ironically, when the fleeing nobles' private soldiers turned around and faced their original allies, they were 10 times more ferocious. Their survival instinct turned them into red-eyed fanatics. Behind them were the gleaming spears that were driving them forward. This was a little different from what Sir Marloser, the captain of the 7th Swordsman Brigade of the Coast Guards of Ampere-Seal, had expected. Not only did the princess and her men appear, but they also barged in. But this collision was a little too decisive and fierce. Not only did they destroy Rodu's army, but they also seemed to have seen through their position at a glance. The princess' aggressive approach was in direct proportion to Marloser's increasingly pale face. But what should he do now? The knight, who had almost never really killed an enemy in his life, looked back at his companion. In the heavy rain, the young man in the armor of the White Lion Legion held his sword in his hand and was silent. He was like a marble statue, allowing the water droplets to slide down his forehead and cheeks. He was completely undecided. "We've been discovered." How did they discover us? Maybe now is not the time to think about this. He looked up, his gray-blue eyes reflecting the cold light of the rows of spears, flashing with the light of reason. "In that case, let's change the game." Above the clouds, lightning was zigzagging out a dazzling trajectory. "Balta, you have a good student." When Leiter Dullo received the order from the messenger, his eyes showed a hint of approval as he spoke lightly. Marquis Balta shook his head. "Her Royal Highness is not weak at all. This doesn't seem to be the work of Oberwe. Even Makarov isn't that decisive. The enemy seems to have a commander that we're unfamiliar with. The Coast Guard's combat power is really worrying. It seems like Owen wants to use the advantage of numbers to stall the enemy. Just like what we did in Lonch." The old man looked in the direction of the port. In his vision there was a gray roof. "It's like a huge meat grinder. Slowly the last drop of Erewhon's blood flows." "Mr. Archbishop, these words are not directed at you." Leiter glanced at the guest beside him again and replied faintly. That person smiled faintly and didn't seem to mind. "We were also wrong about the decisions we made in the past. There's nothing to avoid. The Holy War is imminent, and the Temple does not wish for new misunderstandings to arise because of past misunderstandings." The old man glanced at him, neither agreeing nor disagreeing with him. "Old commander." Balta was a little restless. "You're the regimental commander now, Balta," the old man replied. "Don't worry, I won't blame Owen for this. Victory or defeat is always the most important thing in a war. He has a very good plan. Using numbers to bully others is also a skill. But I'm afraid Her Royal Highness is going to suffer this time. On this battlefield, it's the blood of Erewhon's people that flows. Aren't they also a bunch of excellent young men? What a pity." The old man shook his head. The sky was gradually brightening. But the battle situation was not like that. The news sent back from the front clearly told Brando that the Coast Guards were changing their strategy. But changing their minds at the last minute was not a good way to play, especially when their intentions were so obvious. Brando couldn't help but sneer. The Coast Guard's generals had decided to engage in street warfare with him. Haha, he almost laughed out loud to express the joy in his heart. The attack and defense of Kirko, the attack and defense of Braggs, the capture of Ampere-Seal, the pain of Sioux, the blood of White City. There was no need to deliberately recall them. One by one, classic battles appeared in his mind. But more importantly, he had personally participated in them. He had fought against Cruz's people, against Madara's people, against All for One, and even against the Myernas who lived in the dark, and not the third-rate Coast Guards of Ampere-Seal. He turned around, and who were the people beside him? Loka Vanden Elvis, Enrique Aisha, Freya Alicia, the three famous heroes of Erewhon's history. Two of them were masters of cavalry tactics, and one was the Valkyrie of Erewhon. In addition, there was Breton of Bucci, a strong man who led a group of knights to fight a bloody path out from the hands of the one-eyed dragon Tarkus, and the captain of the Royal Knight Regiment, Mach. The most famous young generals of Erewhon's future surrounded him. They had truly changed an era and pulled Erewhon out of the darkest abyss of history. Although it was only for a short period of time, they were all heroes of their time. Although Erewhon was defeated, it was not because of the battle. This time the other party was really digging their own graves. Perhaps the generals on the other side would never have thought that in the next century on the continent of Wond, because of the participation of players, the war would change at a rapid rate. It was a dark and war-torn era, but it was also a magnificent era supported by geniuses and crazy ideals. But what was always right now might not necessarily be true in the future. Loka, Enrique, Freya, Breton, Mach, the other party wants to use street warfare to delay us. Brando looked at the battlefield in front of him and smiled gently. They want to turn this place into a meat grinder. Did you all doze off during the tactical class? Mach stared at him coldly. The other party's previous orders did not seem wrong, but it was not a big deal. At most, it was just following the rules. If it were them, they might have been able to do better. Breton did not answer. The Brando in front of him had changed too much. In fact, since the escape from Bucci, the other party had been transforming. Although he did not want to admit it, he had to admit that the young man in front of him was no longer the miller's son that he looked down on. Although the grudge between the two of them had been resolved, it did not mean that he would stand on the other party's side. Among the four of them, only Loka Vanden Elvis smiled slightly and did not seem to care. This young man was wearing the black military uniform of the Royal Knights Academy. He had light blonde hair and tied it into a ponytail. He looked a little shy and did not completely break away from the impression that the Royal Knights Academy had left on them. He was a little immature, but he already had the calm temperament of a general. In fact, in history he had always been the leader of the three heroes. Loka Vanden Elvis was the eldest son of the family. His father was an unknown noble in the Viro province. In history, the family had never produced any great figures, but Loka was undoubtedly an exception. In history, Loka Vanden Elvis had single-handedly toyed with Cypher's army in the palm of his hand. Due to his gentle personality, he was known as the Sheathed Sword. It meant that once he revealed his ability, he would be unstoppable and invincible. It was a pity that before this sheathed sword could be unsheathed, he died in the war in the north. He did not even have the time to participate in the Second War of the Black Roses. This was one of Erewhon's biggest regrets. Of course, this time, Brando would definitely not let this regret happen again. The reason why he gathered these young people around him was that he was afraid that they would die in an accident in the war in Ampere-Seal. For example, Enrique of the three of them had died in the end. However, without experience, it was impossible to forge a sharp sword. Brando knew this, but he could only do his best to prevent it. My lord, this is not going to be easy. The Coast Guards are more powerful than us, and they have the geographical advantage. If they are determined to fight us in the streets, I'm afraid it will be difficult for us to deal with them. Enrique was riding on a horse, his black hair shining as he replied with a smile. This guy now looked a little like Carglass, completely different from his quiet personality in the future. He had a good relationship with Loka and they used to call each other brother. It must be the double blow of the decline of the kingdom and Loka's death that changed him. Brando thought sympathetically. That's not necessarily true. He smiled. Did you forget that I was invited by Her Highness to give you a lesson today? Actually, it's very easy to defeat the Coast Guards like how we defeated Rodu. Bullsh *T. Mauka made a direct conclusion. That's not necessarily true. Brando laughed. Moke, why don't we make a bet? If I can really do it, why don't you do something for me? The gray-haired young man glanced at him. What is it? Come and be my servant, how about that? Brando snickered in his heart. The future leader of the Iron Masked Knight would be his servant. He still remembered how this guy caused trouble for the players in the past. It had to be said that Brando was still a narrow-minded guy. Of course, as for failure? What a joke, that was something he had never considered. Moke was silent for a while. Of course, he knew that the other party would not make such a bet for no reason. However, the young were fearless. He finally nodded. What if you lose? I'll be your adjutant. Moke. Freya could not help but remind him. She was probably the only one who knew Brando the best. However, the gray-haired young man only glanced at her and replied, Don't worry, Freya. I won't embarrass him too much. I'm just afraid that you'll be embarrassed. The future goddess of war was speechless. Very well, the contract is established. Brando smiled. You guys come over here. I'll tell you how to fight this battle. In fact, Freya's worries soon became reality. Brando began to issue orders. The next moment, the cavalry of the Wangli Knight Academy began to advance in the direction his sword was pointing. From a bird's eye view, it looked like a huge arrow had split into countless tentacles. The cavalry was attacking together, moving as fast as lightning along the streets of various sizes. Almost in an instant. In the darkness, the expressions of the generals of the White Lion Legion, who were closely watching everything that happened on the huge battlefield, changed. Countless scouts were shuttling back and forth between the front lines and the rear. After a lot of ambiguous information was gathered, a clear picture appeared in front of everyone. The command center of the White Lion Legion fell into a panic. How are they working together? They're crazy. Martha above, this is impossible. Everyone was completely dumbfounded. In the direction of the Evergreen Square. In fact, in front of the square was a densely packed area of shops. At this moment, Baron Rodu's defeated soldiers were attacking their allies' positions from all directions through these alleys. Behind them, the Young Knight Academy meticulously executed their tactics. The Young Knight formed small teams to drive away the defeated soldiers. On the other hand, the Young Knights split up and formed tactical teams to outflank the Coast Guard's positions. In just 10 minutes, the junior officers of the Coast Guards had experienced a long and unbearable nightmare. This was beyond the common sense they had learned on all occasions. The enemy could appear at any time in any direction, wherever they wanted to, and attack their positions. They had built a standard line of defense according to the drill provided by the White Lion Legion sergeants. In the face of such an attack, they were almost vulnerable. In front of this position, the attacks of the princess side seemed to have turned into real, flowing water. When the whole army moved, mercury would flow to the ground. The situation had completely changed. How are they maintaining the command system? Image crystal. Impossible. On such a huge battlefield, any magic communication will interfere with each other. Listen carefully. Even the wizards of Buga can't do this. Forster, the head of the White Lion Legion's 1st Guard Regiment, roared at his adjutant. His adjutant's face was pale and could only obey. But perhaps it was his adjutant's bitter smile that made Forster realize that his anger would not change the current situation. He could not help but raise his head stiffly. He stared blankly at the huge map hanging in the middle of the tent. On the map, the bright red line depicted the Coast Guard's line of defense seemed so heavy, clumsy, and full of holes. It was like a silent mockery to the entire White Lion Legion. But this was an absolutely standard line of defense. Even Cruz, the powerful Empire's infantry drill book, could not find a more perfect example of this line of defense. It was heavy and clumsy, but at the same time, it was also stable and could not be bypassed. It was invulnerable. Every point of its defense was so precise, as if it had been tempered thousands of times and modified by generations of people. He was like a slow-moving giant. There were only two outcomes when facing him: let him bleed to the last drop of blood, or let him bleed to the last drop of his own blood. It was like a perfect meat grinder. It was filled with his own life, but also the enemy's life. There was no other way but to break through directly. The White Lion Legion, Owen and Maloise had carefully arranged this bloody battlefield, ready to let Her Highness bleed to the last drop of her blood. But just as they were about to throw a heavy punch, they found that their enemy had turned into a pile of loose sand in front of them, and then drilled into their bodies. In an instant, the giant's huge body became his own greatest enemy. The stable line of defense seemed to have fallen into a precarious state in the blink of an eye, but no one knew what had happened. They would never understand how the students of the Royal Knight Academy turned the army into a pile of loose sand. In all common sense, it was a sign of an army's collapse, a sign of suicide. Even Baron Rodu had explained it perfectly 15 minutes ago. But in the blink of an eye, the enemy's black cavalry had completely obliterated this common sense. They did not understand. It was as if they did not understand the earth-shattering and profound changes that the radio in the other world had brought to the battlefield after World War I. Brando was using another method to make the same change. This was not his credit. The players had more ingenious methods than him to achieve all of this. But for Brando this was enough. The wind and rain intertwined. The blond young man raised his hand and looked at the wind spirit spider in his hand. He tied a piece of paper on it, and the elf-like creature disappeared in the wind and rain. He looked back and silently looked in the direction of that person, his heart burning with passion. No one knew better than him that this war in Ampere Seal was destined to change things. This battle lasted less than a quarter of an hour from start to finish. It was destined to be recorded in history. When Forster looked away from the map, he finally realized that he might have made a mistake. He looked at his subordinates, the young men of the White Lion Legion, who still had a look of disbelief on their faces. "My lord, how did they do it?" Some of them even asked. "That's not the point," Forster interrupted them disappointedly. He hoped that the White Lion Legion would be calmer and sharper in the future. "The point now is that the Coast Guards are destined to be defeated. It won't be long before they follow in Rodu's footsteps." The young men were stunned for a moment, then their eyes lit up. "Well, it seems that you all understand," Forster nodded. "According to the plan, it's time for the kingdom's lions to bare their fangs." Everyone was solemn. "Send an order to Owen. Tell him to return to his position. Franz, I want to see you and your knight appear in the predetermined positions at the scheduled time. Khan, put on your cloak. You're ready to go." The Empire's lion, unstoppable. All the knights shouted in unison. Everyone stood at attention, and then with a solemn expression, they saluted this Sir Commander before turning around and leaving. A young man walked past them. "Captain, an army is passing through the Longjing market and approaching the Coast Guard's flank." There was silence in the tent. Forster was slightly stunned. He looked back at the huge map. "That's the area Cullen is in charge of. What flag are they using?" The young man was a little embarrassed and did not answer. "Answer my question, soldier," Forster said sternly. "It's the White Lion battle flag." "My lord." Forster was slightly stunned. "Which division's White Lion battle flag is it?" He hurriedly asked, almost angrily, "Who acted on their own without my orders?" What is it?" "It's the White Lion Legion, the Praetorian Legion," the young man stammered. "Praetorian Legion?" Forster was stunned. Did the White Lion Legion have such a designation? There seemed to be. It was the designation of the infantry knight that followed the late King Eric everywhere. But after the late King Eric passed away, this designation was left vacant forever. It was to pay tribute to Erwin's lion. Forster's expression changed. "P.S. I've been thinking about it for a while. I've been trying to find the feeling in the afternoon. Boo-hoo, I've listened to countless songs. Oh yes, from now on, I'll prepare some manuscripts for release at the end of the month. Remember to leave your votes." To be continued. If you like this work, you're welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 581. The sword was inserted into the meadow between the wilderness and the sky. The blade was as bright as autumn water. The white ribbon with the crescent moon emblem wrapped around the hilt of the sword was twirling in the wind, swaying slightly as if it was in his memory. His wise and deep eyes squinted slightly as he looked with interest at the wide almond-shaped field of vision between heaven and earth. A white cloak covered his body, and under the cloak, a pair of rough hands held a black scabbard. He stood upright like a majestic lion. "My king, it's late." The old man smiled and turned back to ask calmly, "Krentel, guess what I'm looking at?" "Beyond this grassland, forward and forward to the land of Erwin." "Erwin, that's the land that we will protect with our lives. But I'm looking at my sword, Krentel." The old man retracted his gaze. The sword looked unique and slender in the wilderness, but it was able to support the world. "Your sword?" "I'm thinking thousands of years later, will anyone still pick up this sword, wipe away the dust on it and remember our oath? Will our descendants be able to withstand the test of time? Do you think Erwin will exist for a long time?" "Erwin will exist for a long time, Your Majesty. But time flies. What if one day our descendants forget the promise we made today? The people of Cruz also had the glory of their ancestors, but they have long stopped picking up everything. Maybe one day the people of Erwin will do the same." "Your Majesty." "I don't want Erwin, Krentel." The old man's grayish-blue eyes reflected the shadows of the clouds, and his soft gray hair stuck to the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes. Time had left too heavy a mark on him. The old man felt that the flame in his heart was burning to its end, but at this moment, it seemed to be glowing again. He had seen too many wars, too many sufferings, and too many people who were close to him sacrificed on this land. He closed his eyes, and the scenes of the past were like a golden scroll. It was as if they had left Cruz's land for the first time at dusk under the setting sun. That was where it all began. "What I want is not Erwin and Krentel, but the soul and belief of this land. I want this voice to be passed on forever. I want the resistance and pursuit of Erwin to never be forgotten. I want its nobles to always remember their duty, Krentel. Remember, if one day the people of Erewhon really forget all of this, then this sword will return to where it came from, and it will no longer protect this country. In that case, the sword would return to where it came from. Your Majesty, Erewhon has really forgotten everything. It's only been 200 years. This land will no longer bear the burden of that perfect ideal, but today the sword had returned. The sword in Krentel's eyes was emitting endless golden light. It was trembling in the girl's hand as if it had been reborn. It was trembling excitedly and could break out of the box at any moment. Krentel suddenly felt that his tears were gushing out uncontrollably, although he had stopped crying a long time ago. But those were the tears in his heart. Your Majesty, do you see? Someone picked up this sword, wiped away the dust on it, and remembered our oath. Therefore he felt that belief again. After being forgotten for centuries, the glorious flag returned to Erewhon. Brando also looked at the Leo sword in Freya's hand. At that moment he heard the sound of the sword, like a landslide or a tsunami, as if a huge voice was reverberating and narrating. He seemed to see the glorious era and the two elongated figures in the lonely wilderness. The sword was fulfilling the oath. Would Erewhon exist for a long time? Erewhon will exist for a long time, Your Majesty. What happened, Freya? Maynard asked loudly. Everyone was stunned by the intense light that suddenly emitted from Freya's sword. I don't know. Freya stared at the trembling sword in her hand, dumbfounded. It seemed to have come alive and was responding to something. It seems to have felt something. The whole of Ampere Seal shook. Forster rushed out of the tent like a madman. The entire command post of the White Lion Legion was shrouded in a loud buzzing sound. In the camp, everyone involuntarily stopped and raised their heads to look in one direction. Right in the middle of the camp, the huge White Lion war flag was emitting an incomparably dazzling light. The war flag stood tall in the wind and rain. The white lion on the flag seemed to have come alive at this moment, baring its fangs and claws. The glorious flag. Forster was suddenly stunned. He seemed to have understood something and looked towards the west in a daze. Knight Captain Cullen of the 4th Column of the White Lion Legion was also looking in the same direction. In the wind and rain, an army he had never seen before was slowly passing through the curtain of rain and arriving in front of him. There seemed to be singing in the rain. I swear an oath before this sword. I swear to lead my people away from slaughter and strife, away from the arrogance and greed of the nobles. I swear to not repeat this cold-blooded mistake. I will make the nobles of the new kingdom follow the spirit of the knight, fair and strict, upright and brave, benevolent and generous. I swear that I will do so today, and every day will be the same. Silver elven helmets bathed in the rain. The white lion on their shoulders seemed to have walked out of the legends. The sword in their hands was 5 feet long and as wide as a palm. There was the mark of a lion's heart on the hilt. They wore heavy armor and a scaled skirt. At this moment, the legend and reality overlapped. The army that slowly walked out of the rain hit the softest part of the hearts of the White Lion Legion in an instant. It was as if they had walked out of a brilliant historical story, and even had the mysterious and magical aura of a fairy tale. The army that only existed in legends had appeared in front of them. It was their predecessors, their history, their pride. The White Lion Legion's Praetorian Legion. But now it was their enemy. Therefore they had violated their oath. The glory they claimed to have inherited from King Eric was about to be washed away. The legendary army was about to remove the laurels from their heads. Everyone could not help but take a step back subconsciously. It was the legend they had heard countless times from the stories that had accompanied them as they grew up. It was the legend that had strengthened their beliefs. Although the White Lion Legion walked silently in the rain, it was only half a platoon. All of the soldiers in the White Lion Legion were veterans. They could calculate the number of people in the enemy with just a glance. 45. But so what? Knight Cullen felt his palms sweating. Ever since he became a knight, he had never lost the courage to hold his sword before facing his opponent. But the honor of a soldier did not allow him to abandon his sword and surrender. Moreover, the fear was only a momentary illusion. Cullen reacted instantly. He gritted his teeth and shouted, "What a disgrace! Where did this clown come from? How dare he disguise himself as the White Lion Legion?" His voice spread far and wide in the rain. The White Lion Legion? The army stopped and the commander was clearly taken aback. Now was the time. Grabbing the fleeting opportunity, Cullen raised his sword. White Lion Legion, 4th Column, listen to my command. Destroy these fanatics who blaspheme King Eric. The soldiers of the White Lion Legion roared in unison. It was as if this was the only thing that could dispel the doubts in their hearts. Just like how their ancestors and comrades had charged at Cruz's cavalry on the highlands, for the first time in thousands of years, they charged at Erwin's people. The horn of the White Lion Legion echoed for a long time. The melodious sound contained the long and glorious history of this legendary army. Every time they charged forward, they had never met a worthy opponent. It was not because they were invincible but because they were indomitable. In front of the White Lion Legion, no enemy could make them tremble in fear. Because this was the courage of a lion. This was the belief that King Eric had given them. The soldiers unsheathed their swords. There were only 200 of them, but they carried the aura of 1,000 men. The White Lion Legion's flag advanced in the rain. Their formation was as tight as a sharp blade, sweeping across the battlefield. However, it was not only discipline that maintained this sharp blade but also faith. For the first time today the hand holding the sword felt sluggish. It really is the White Lion Legion. Carglass suddenly felt that this was an illusion of fate. It was as if an invisible hand had arranged for them to meet, and this meeting was eternal. However, he also understood what it meant to have an unexpected enemy formation on the battlefield. There's a change in the situation. The young commander decided to meet up with the Lord immediately. But before that, they were blocked by another army called the White Lion Legion. He unsheathed his sword. Cullen gripped his sword tightly as well. Listen to my command. White Lion Legion. In the pouring rain, 2 orders were shouted at the same time. Carglass had expected this, but Cullen felt as if he had been shot by a sharp arrow. In front of him, the strange yet familiar army suddenly sped up. Although their heavy armor dragged the ground and their swords accompanied them, it was as if every one of them had the terrifying aura of a galloping horse. The ground trembled, and the green slabs on the long street were slightly tilted up. Infantry Knight. Cullen's palms turned white. This was the legendary Infantry Knight. The White Lion Legion's armor was surrounded by a green wind. The White Lion Legion had lost this forging technique after the Battle of Lune. This was the core technique of the half-plate Wind Empress, a secret technique that allowed heavy armor to be as light as a light armor. They were all magic armors. The soldiers of the White Lion Legion felt oppressed. Since the end of the Holy War, or 2 centuries, Erwin had never had an army like this. But the key was the indomitable aura of the 2 legions. If there was anything different, it was that the other party seemed to have a kind of perseverance that they did not have. They could see the pride and glory of being a soldier, but there was something in the other party's sparkling eyes under the mask that they had never seen before. Perseverance and pursuit. The 2 armies were only a hair's breadth apart. The veterans of the White Lion Legion were fearless. They even felt a little ashamed. It was not the glory of the White Lion Legion to fight with numbers. But this did not stop them from raising their swords. Their hearts were filled with determination. The experience they had gained from hundreds and thousands of battles allowed them to deal with all kinds of unexpected situations coldly and calmly. But an accident really did happen. There were still 10 meters to go. The heavily armored White Lion Legion raised their 2-handed swords. The swords were 5 feet long and as wide as a palm. There was a lion's heart mark on the hilt and 3 claw marks on the blade. It was the legendary sword of the lion. But Cullen saw that the swords in the hands of the enemy were glowing slightly. Not good. An ominous thought suddenly flashed through his mind. Dodge. The captain of the night tried to salvage the situation at the last moment, but it was too late. All of a sudden, Carglass and his White Lion guards raised their swords and slashed in unison. They slashed in unison. A full moon of water flew out from the swords and formed a water curtain that spread forward on the long street. There was a faint flash of white light in the water curtain. It was like a perfect arc. The arc moved forward and crossed a distance of 10 meters. It was like a sparkling wave. The frontline soldiers of the White Lion Legion's 4th column fell to the ground as if they had hit an invisible wall. Moments later, they screamed in agony. Blood dyed the rain red and spread across the street. Even the stone slabs were stained with the color of blood. The White Raven sword technique. This is impossible. No, it was earlier. This should be the sword technique of the Wind Empress, the White Lion's Fong. Cullen's heart sank. There was an orderly clatter as the White Lion guards sheathed their large swords. The entire army was like a single entity. At that moment, the countless scenes of history began to overlap in front of the White Lion Legion like chaotic fragments. The past, the present, the legends, the stories, the glory, the victories, and the defeats. Countless memories flowed through their hearts like a quiet river. That was the White Lion Legion. But this name no longer belonged to them. It was as if there was a loud voice between heaven and earth. Today I will take your crown because you have deviated from the path of glory. It was the voice of King Eric. At the same moment, suddenly Kargleis raised his head. His eyes were filled with disbelief. To be precise, everyone present stopped what they were doing. The air seemed to be filled with a heavy pressure. Even the flow of the wind and water became viscous. Everyone felt a great pressure. There was a resonance in their bodies. Swords and oaths. Resonance. With a loud bang, Forster saw a golden beam of light shoot up from the banner. In just a moment, another beam of light rose from the east. Two beams of light intertwined in the morning sky. Foster did not speak for a long time because he knew it was the Lionheart sword. King Eric's sword. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 582. The pillars of light reflected each other in the rain. From afar, it seemed that the rain that passed through them had turned into pure gold. Everyone raised their heads. A crack appeared in the dark clouds where not a single ray of sunlight could penetrate. Pure white light descended from behind the clouds like a pair of wings, gently protecting the crowns of the people. Beams of light pierced through the clouds and fell over the harbor. Lighter Duluo stood in front of the window. The old soldier seemed to be pouring all his strength into this standing posture, standing straight. Only his hands were clenched into fists. The ancient king walked on top of the clouds, watching silently, but the descendants could only be speechless. Did the nobles of Erewhon still remember the oath engraved on the long sword? They could not answer. Sir Knight. Marquis Balta was restless. He also felt the agitation in his heart, but he was more afraid that the old knight would suddenly change his mind. Although he was already the commander of the White Lion Legion, when it came to who had more prestige in the army and who could rally the troops, it was definitely this old lion of the empire. The old man slowly turned around, his expression resolute. There was only a glimmer of light in the depths of his gray eyes, as if he was nurturing determination. He looked up and said slowly, Balta, the White Lion Legion has lost the flag in our hearts for a long time, but because of this, we cannot lose the glory of being a soldier. Today if the late king asks us for that answer, but we have already deviated from that glorious path. We can only answer your majesty with the last dignity of the kingdom's army. The White Lion Legion will not rest until death. The White Lion Legion will not rest until death. Marquis Balta froze. He looked at the tall figure of the old knight. Outside the window, on the horizon, lightning fell in the storm. However, there was a time when he was young and frivolous. He had perseverance and ideals, but the struggle for power and court had long worn away all of these. Even he himself did not know what he had lost for all of this. At this moment he suddenly saw the young man with a spear in his hand, the flag raised high, galloping on the high ground. The spear shone, the horn sounded melodious. He had been so close to his ideals. That was the history of Erewhon. The Marquis felt his eyes moisten. He bowed deeply to his teacher with red eyes. Today he finally understood that he had finally learned the last lesson of the night. Persist. The crew's people were once glorious, a voice said quietly. But we learned to compromise. Ideals and reality are not always harmonious. A free and firm heart is certainly desirable, but a person who has achieved self-sacrifice is also worthy of respect. The owner of the voice lowered his head and bowed slightly to Lighter Dullo. The old man shook his head with red eyes and sobbed, Old friend, Wood Erewhon is bleeding. I understand. The former Archbishop of Ampere Seal was in the room. At this moment he could not help but close his eyes slightly, his expression somewhat moved. He sighed heavily. Yak built a kingdom full of heroes. I'm sorry. It was at this moment that a servant in a priest's robe suddenly pushed open the door and shouted in a panic, Lord Archbishop, they are resonating too much. We can't control it anymore. Wood did not seem to hear him. He just looked at Ampere Seal outside the window with emotion. He knew this kingdom and these people. Even at the last moment there were still people fighting for it. But whether right or wrong, at least they had courage. Compared to those cowards who hid in the dark and shivered, at least there were people who were fighting against fate. However, one day Cruz would also be at sunset, and the glory of the empire would no longer be there. What would happen then? Lord Archbishop? Do your best. They know, he'll always notice, Wood replied without looking back. He thought of the young man he saw that day and shook his head. But whether it's right or wrong, there are some things we have to do. As for the result, let's leave it to history. The light that fell between the clouds was like a big hand, and the huge pressure pinned everyone to the ground. It was the curtain call. Holding a long sword in his hand, Cullen stood in the torrential rain. He just wanted to cry to his heart's content. Perhaps he had already cried, but his tears merged with the rain. He saw with his own eyes that the golden light seemed to split the rain and fell on the army opposite. At that moment he knew that no matter the result, this would be the last performance of the kingdom's White Lion Legion. That person, he had personally handed the war flag to this legion, personally placed the laurel on their heads and personally gave them glory. But today he was standing opposite them and asking them to bow their heads and surrender. Never. Cullen raised his head, stubbornly like a child. His gaze seemed to penetrate the heavy dark clouds and see the final moment. But the child will eventually grow up, June father? Perhaps this is our answer. He gritted his teeth, tears already gushing out. My fellow comrades of the White Lion Legion, my brothers. The claws and teeth of the White Lion Legion once shone on the highlands, and we once defended the kingdom's territory, the young commander's voice roared in the wind and rain. But no matter when, no matter where, we must remember the motto of the White Lion Legion. The White Lion Legion will not rest until death do us part. The White Lion Legion will not rest until death do us part. Many soldiers cried. They suddenly realized what they were facing. What they had once yearned for, what they had persevered for, was now on the other side. They seemed to be fighting a losing battle, but the soldiers still struggled to pick up their swords. This was a choice, because that was where their honor lay. It was the courage of the White Lion Legion. Those who fight with me today will be my brothers in the future, until the end of the world. Cullen raised his sword with great difficulty, almost trembling as he roared, "Charge!" In the light, a majestic pressure pressed down on everyone, making them unable to move. But the kingdom's White Lion Legion was moving forward, as if they were crawling bit by bit. Everyone's faces were filled with determination and courage as they charged towards Brando's White Lion Legion. They were as slow as a snail, but they were unstoppable. When Carglass raised his head, he saw the scene unfolding before him. They had experienced the calamity of wolves, the trials in the Black Forest, the teachings of Brando, the most systematic elven swordsmanship, the most ancient White Lion battle tactics, and the finest White Lion armor. They were proud because they were born with it. They thought that they represented the most glorious history of the kingdom, and that they were invincible. But today they finally understood what it meant to be the soul of an army. Everyone was watching this scene, watching as Cullen and his soldiers launched the slowest charge in history. However, what awaited them wasn't mockery, but the most serious expressions of their enemies. "Your Majesty," Carglass raised his hands and shouted, "let us have a fair duel. There is no right or wrong. Let us respect each other." The light dissipated in an instant. Carglass and his men's White Lion armor was covered in a layer of golden light. The golden light was slowly receding, forming golden runes that were engraved on the armor. If Brando were here, he would have recognized the White Lion armor that had been modified by King Eric. It was the White Lion armor that existed in history. This was the recognition of the White Lion Legion. It was only at this moment that Carglass understood that they had gained the recognition of the White Lion Legion. He raised his sword as well. There was no need for him to give an order. In fact, the moment the light and the pressure disappeared, the two armies that had transcended history and the present clashed with each other. This was the most direct confrontation between the past and the present, the most direct confrontation between the two armies. The soldiers of the White Lion Legion slashed their swords at Carglass and his men's White Lion armor, but they were unable to penetrate the magical barrier. The golden light around the White Lion armor flickered slightly, and the soldiers' swords were deflected away. The White Lion armor was designed by Brando based on Maximilian's armor. The thickness of the armor was no more than 3 millimeters, but its defensive value was as high as 6. It was almost equivalent to a double-layered hinged plate armor that was more than 5 millimeters thick. This kind of plate armor had never existed on Earth. Even in Wound, a swordsman at the pinnacle of iron rank would have his mobility greatly restricted when wearing it. In fact, there were very few infantry troops that were below Tier 4 who would wear such heavy armor in battle. That was usually the choice of cavalry. The White Lion armor didn't just provide the armor's own protection. Because it was a magical armor, the wind elemental defensive spell that surrounded it also provided an additional 5 points of magical defense. Even for the kingdom's White Lion Legion, whose average strength was at the pinnacle of black iron, it would be difficult for them to break through 5 points of magical defense. However, since the decline of the royal family, the situation of the White Lion Legion was not as good as it used to be. In the past, the White Lion Legion did have a glorious period when everyone was given magical armor and enchanted swords. However, even now, only a small number of elite troops in the Legion were given magical armor. As for enchanted weapons, they were out of the question. Due to the size and material of the weapon, it was harder to enchant it than armor. Therefore it was more valuable. Erewhon, including the royal family's knight regiment, did not have any army that could afford enchanted weapons. Not to mention the White Lion Legion's 4th Regiment was not considered an elite unit in the Legion. There were more than 200 people in the Legion, and only a few of them had magical swords. Most of them were personal items. In fact, when Cullen swung his sword at Cargly's neck, he could not help but feel bitter. The sword in his hand was a family heirloom. Although it was only a glimmering magical sword, it was at least on the level of an enchanted weapon. However, when he swung his sword, he only managed to make a deep cut on Cargly's armor. Of course, Cullen did not know that Cargly's White Lion Legion's armor was specially reinforced. He thought that everyone in the Legion had the same armor, and his heart sank. He was a silver-ranked swordsman, and yet he could not even break through Cargly's armor. If even he could not do it, the others would not be able to do it. Cullen was startled, and so was Cargly's. He did not know how powerful the White Lion Legion's veterans were. Cargly's strength had reached the mid-silver rank after his experience in the Black Forest, and his White Raven sword style was far superior to Cargly's. However, Cargly's simple military sword style almost caught him off guard. It was just that the sword was too fast. It was as if the other party had guessed his intentions. He blocked the direction of his sword and slashed at his neck. If not for the White Lion Legion's armor being stronger than expected, Cargly's head would have been separated from his body. At this moment, Cargly's felt the pain that Buga, the White Knight, and Ibron felt when they fought against Brando. Cargly's could not help but break out in cold sweat. He was not the only one who was breaking out in cold sweat. The other youths from Tonajul were also getting more and more frightened. Although they still had the upper hand, the White Lion Legion had been losing soldiers since the beginning of the battle, while Cargly's side did not even suffer a single light injury. However, it was clear that this was not due to them. In fact, the White Lion Legion's battle armor was simply too overpowered. In fact, they were constantly being suppressed by the White Lion Legion's veterans. They almost couldn't even retaliate. However, the White Lion Legion's veterans would often slash them more than 10 times, and the White Lion Legion's armor would not be damaged at all. However, the White Lion Legion's veterans would often use the Sword of the Lion to counterattack, and the White Lion Legion soldiers would often be severely injured or killed. The veterans of the White Lion Legion did not have any fancy battle techniques. They relied on the limited acceleration provided by the defective White Lion armor to seize the opportunity to attack. Every single time, Cargly's and his men would be caught off guard. However, the more Cargly's fought, the more surprised he became. On the other hand, Cargly's was having a hard time. No matter how much of an advantage they had, they would never be able to win. Moreover, Cargly's men were not a bunch of weaklings. Cargly's men were like rookies on the battlefield. All they lacked was experience. However, they were becoming more and more mature. Their counterattacks and defenses were becoming more and more stable. In comparison, Cargly's men had become their teachers, teaching them how to kill themselves. Cargly's could not help but close his eyes in pain. Cargly's could not take it anymore. He was not a fool. If this continued, they would not be able to learn anything. He was afraid that the morale of Cargly's White Lion Legion would be depleted. Although arrogance was a path to death, an army could not be without its own pride. He could not help but look at the White Lion Legion's veterans with admiration. At the same time, he gave the order, "White Lion Legion, abandon your defenses and attack with all your might." He almost roared out these words. It was somewhat laughable. Their clumsy defense was completely useless in front of the other party. Instead, it was better to simply leave the defense to the White Lion battle armor and go all out to crush the other party. Although the order sounded ridiculous, it was the best idea that Cargly's could think of. It was also the most effective. The young men from Tonajul no longer panicked when they gave up their defenses. It was as if they had returned to the dark forest. Their opponents were still those terrifying monsters. They did not need to be confused anymore. All they needed to do was to muster up all their courage and charge forward like that day. That was enough. Cargly's and his White Lion Legion roared in unison. They raised the Sword of the Lion in their hands and charged forward. At that moment, their training in the dark forest began to show its effects. They swung their swords at the enemies in front of them. At that moment, Cargly's knew that the imminent defeat had arrived. The sword was dazzling. The White Raven sword technique's dense air blades converged together like waves in the rain, bringing with it a hazy white mist. It made one realize why it was named the White Raven. It was a flock of gray-white birds flapping their wings in the air. They flew through the crowd. Blood fell like rain. Cargly's was on the verge of tears. He did not understand why he was here. Shouldn't their enemies be Cruz's men? Instead, he brought his men here, causing them to lose their lives and all their glory. But at the last moment, the White Lion Legion's fourth column burst forth with the greatest courage. They no longer retreated or defended themselves. Instead, they clashed with Karglai's men. It was no longer a battle. The soldiers of the White Lion Legion were only seeking death. Even Karglais could not bear to watch. Enough. Stop it. He stood in the heavy rain and roared like a lion. Everyone stop. In fact, there was no need for his orders. The youths from Trendheim had already stopped one after another. Then the soldiers of the White Lion Legion also stopped. Many of them were completely covered in blood, but they were still panting and staring at their enemies, holding their weapons tightly in their hands. The streets were dyed red with blood. Both sides stood in the middle of the street. There was a moment of silence. "I don't know who you are," Karglais panted in the rain. His voice echoed in the rain. "Commander, I hope you will give us a way out. This massacre should not continue. The White Lion Legion will not retreat, even if it means dying to the last man." Karglais looked at the heavily armored commander of the White Lion Legion. He was also panting heavily, disheartened, but still determined. Karglais took a deep breath. "This is not retreating." He closed his eyes. "Do you think the White Lion Legion will continue to fight against Erwin's men? Is this where your glory lies? Why are you here? Answer me. Is it only for power and profit? No, this is not what the White Lion Legion is after. Is this what you yearn for? When you joined the glorious name of the White Lion Legion and swore to that flag, is this what you yearned for? Open your eyes and take a good look." Karglais roared. He clenched his fists. "Look at your flag, it is stained red with blood. Look at this port, it is soaked with blood. But it is the blood of Erwin's men. Listen, this is the sound of burning fire, this is the sound of the kingdom dying. Can't you hear it? This is what you swore to protect? This vast territory, this is what you swore to protect with your life. This is the homeland protected by the ancient glory." He stared at them, enunciating each word clearly. "We are killing our kingdom. So, please step aside." "Okay." With a clang, Karglai's sword fell to the ground. He saw the blood-stained flag that Karglais was pointing at. The White Lion was stained with the blood of Erwin's men. Is this what they are after? In the rain, the knight of the White Lion Legion knelt on the ground and cried. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 583. Amidst the wind and rain, a golden pillar of light pierced through the heavens and earth. It was as if a voice had been added to everyone. It said, "Your Majesty, Erwin has not been destroyed, and one day it will exist for a long time. That flag will always fly on this glorious land, long and glorious." That was the sound of the sword. Freya watched as the sword in her hand burned fiercely. Then, another pillar of light pierced through the heavens and earth. In the command center of the White Lion Legion, the captain of the guards, Forster, also watched as the flag left behind by the late King Eric ignited in flames. In an instant, a dazzling light rose from the flag. It turned into a golden shuttle and rose into the sky, but disappeared into the clouds in the blink of an eye. Forster was left dumbfounded. The flag of the White Lion Legion that had been passed down for centuries was burned to ashes in his hands right under his nose. "Brando?" Freya's voice was weak and filled with disbelief. "What's going on? The sword seems to be summoning you." Brando did not say a word because he felt it too. The sword was summoning him. But it was not the Lionheart sword. He suppressed the shock in his heart and turned to look at the Emerald Knight beside Freya. Under the Emerald Knight's mask, sky-blue phosphorescence quietly burned in its eye sockets. It looked at him as if it wanted to see through him. "You know what's going on, don't you?" Brando could not help but roar, "The Ashen Knight Krentel." The Emerald Knight was one step behind Freya. It looked at Brando without saying a word. Because in the memories of the undead, there was only pain. But in the abyss of pain there were flashing images. The people and things in the images were so familiar, yet so unfamiliar. It was as if everything was meaningless. "Krentel, do you really want to swear an oath to protect this sword? If you swear an oath, you will never be at peace. Your soul will linger on this land, unable to rest in peace. Your Majesty, for the sake of this belief, we have long abandoned everything." The young man with long, pale blonde hair smiled and replied. The old man sighed and looked at him. "Krentel, I've separated the sword from the soul. I'll give one to you and the other to Lucan. You will protect the royal family with it, and Lucan will become the next commander of the White Lion Legion. If the nobles do as I say, one day you will leave with it and go to Ranner. Until one day someone picked up my sword and remembered our oath. When that day comes, the soul of the Lionheart sword will definitely acknowledge him. Your Majesty. Krentel, you once asked me why I brought the Lionheart sword out of Cruz. The old man was silent for a moment before he suddenly replied, Actually, I didn't choose the Lionheart sword. The Lionheart sword chose me. Your Majesty. Holy Sword Oderfeis inherited the will of the Flame King, but its soul is in the Lionheart sword. His beliefs, his ideals, and everything that the people of Erwin have long forgotten. Krentel, you must never forget that the people of Erwin are also the descendants of the Flame King. In the boundless rain, another pillar of light had disappeared forever along with the war flag of the late King Eric. However, Brando suddenly felt that there was a great soul watching him from above the clouds. It was a majestic, powerful, and noble soul. He could not help but look up. It was not the will of the late King Eric, but an even more blazing and upright law. Dark clouds were gathering there, but suddenly, a pillar of light descended from above the clouds and struck Brando between his eyebrows. Brando could not help but scream. At that moment, it was as if a flaming spear had pierced his mind, causing his entire mind to turn into a sea of fire. He felt that all the pain he had suffered before this was not even worth mentioning. His over 100 points of will was completely useless in the face of this mental torture. Brando. Freya was stunned. Everyone around was stunned. They all felt that the pillar of light that descended from the clouds was the source of the energy that surged above Ampyr's seal. But it was clearly the resonance caused by the Lionheart sword in Freya's hand, so how did it end up with Brando? Wasn't this mistake a little too big? Among everyone present, only Brando, who had experienced all of this personally, completely understood why in an instant. The violent mental shock only lasted for a short while before it ended. At that moment, it was as if there were countless unfamiliar memories and knowledge in his mind. He was all too familiar with this kind of thing. Inheritance. Brando, you're... He immediately heard Orthlis's surprised and somewhat abnormal voice from the bottom of his heart. In fact, this was the first time this wind elf had woken up today. Obviously, everything that had happened before had woken her up. Brando's heart was also filled with shock. He did not have time to answer Orthlis. Instead, he immediately opened his character panel. Switching the menu to the item in his inventory, he saw that at the end of that item, there was a line of boiling hot golden words. Flaming Blade Oderfeis Fragment, Soul, Divine Artifact. Martha Buff. Brando speechlessly raised his head to look at the gloomy sky. The cold sweat on his pale forehead was blown away by the wind and rain, but at this moment he finally understood. So that's why. He finally understood why the sage's slate resonated with the Lionheart sword at the divine artifact level. But the Lionheart sword was clearly a fantasy weapon. Although Bosley had explained that the Lionheart sword was a component of the Flaming Blade Oderfeis, he still had doubts. Because whether or not the Lionheart sword was a component of Oderfeis, when it was a component, it was still a fantasy weapon. At least in the game this was very clear. But today he finally understood. The Lionheart sword was the Lionheart sword, and it originally contained the soul of the Flaming Blade Oderfeis. The two had already merged into one. And the one that resonated with him was actually the soul of the Flaming Blade Oderfeis. And the one that acknowledged Freya was the Lionheart sword itself. Until today when they separated once again. Brando turned to look at Freya. The flames burning on the Lionheart sword in the future Valkyrie's hand were gradually extinguished, and the pillar of light that enveloped her body was slowly dissipating. The Lionheart sword in her hand had completely returned to its original appearance. It was exactly the same as the Lionheart sword in Brando's memory. This was the real King Eric's Lionheart sword. Congratulations, Freya. You have received the recognition of the Lionheart sword and the late King Eric. Brando smiled faintly. Now, you are the real Erwin Valkyrie. Me? Valkyrie? Brando, what are you talking about? Freya looked at the sword in her hand, somewhat baffled. Then she looked at Brando with concern. Brando, but what's going on with your body? Do you also have a Lionheart sword? Brando looked up. In fact, after the pillar of light descended from above the clouds and hit him, it still shrouded his body at this moment. The surging magical power in the air did not weaken. Instead, it strengthened. The resonance caused by the Lionheart sword was stronger than before. Those who were slightly more sensitive to the flow of magical power could even hear the crackling sound in the air. It was as if a huge amount of power was flowing and gathering in the sky above the harbor. In the blink of an eye, a huge magical vortex was formed above the clouds. This is the true resonance of a divine artifact. A voice came from behind the two. Brando turned around and saw Maynard rushing over with a cold face. She looked at Brando and asked sternly, "You know what's going on, right?" Brando nodded. He had always thought that there should only be Coast Guards stationed at the North Gate, but when the Lionheart sword resonated, he had already realized that he was wrong. And now, everything that was happening to him was even more proof of this. Someone had leaked the news. Or rather, he had trusted the wrong person from the beginning. The White Lion Legion. Brando looked calmly at the north and answered quietly, and, in his field of vision. Suddenly, a brighter and more dazzling beam of light than before was rising in the northern sky, straight into the clouds. The moment it hit the clouds, it formed a small light spot. Then, in the blink of an eye, with a bang, the dark clouds above the entire Ampere Seal were stirred up. The storm outside the harbor seemed to have been torn apart in an instant and stopped, revealing the blue skyline behind it, and above the sky, under the elemental barrier called Tiamat, a huge magic circle was slowly rotating like an endless gear. On it, complicated lines were redrawing the laws of the world little by little. It formed countless regular or irregular patterns, but finally gathered in the sky above Ampere Seal, forming a giant magic circle that was so complex and mysterious that mortals would not be able to see the slightest truth in it in their lifetime. The magic circle corresponded to the whole of Ampere Seal in the sky with a diameter of thousands of miles. Then the second and third beam of light lit up, and together with the fourth beam of light on Brando's body, they were completely connected to the magic circle in the sky. At this moment, everyone could only raise their heads at the same time, losing the ability to speak. Brando also raised his head, but his heart was clear. The flaming blade Oderfeis was here. Cruz's people were here too. They had finally waited for this day, the day the Lionheart sword was resurrected, the day they took back their divine artifact. They had arranged all of this a long time ago. It turned out that this was what Moros wrote in the letter to Wood. It turned out that Princess Magadal had discovered this secret. Everyone was wrong. P.S. 2 updates, 1 5400, 1 3100 in fact is almost equivalent to 3 updates, but for the sake of the continuity of the plot, I did not divide it that much. Eruption means what I say. As for what I want, you know. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 585. In the blue sky, Martha's Tiamat element resonated with the artifact. 4 pillars of light pierced through the sky, supporting the 4 corners of Ampere Seal's skyline. The sky and the sea resonated. Flocks of white birds flew up from the sea, circling the pillars of light under the clear sky, forming a magnificent picture. That day, from Ampere Seal to Sioux, from Grey Harbor to Kanaichi, countless people witnessed this miracle. However, not everyone under this miracle was in the mood to enjoy the beautiful scenery in the sky. In the streets near the north gate of Ampere Seal Port, the night officers of the Royal Night Academy were penetrating and destroying the last line of defense of the Coast Guards in an organized manner. But the situation was slowly changing. As one of the few outstanding graduates of the Royal Night Academy, Olan was leading a few other night officers to break through a temporary barricade set up by the Coast Guards. What he needed to do now was to keep moving forward and create an opening in the Coast Guard's position before the Coast Guards could retreat and form a new line of defense. Behind him, Mayor's Squad 13 and Eden's Squad 14, who had completed the joint attack with him, would continue to circle around the other lines of defense to complete the pincer attack. The responsibilities of each tactical team were clear. The owner of the Wind Spirit Spiders on their shoulders was clearly coordinating the situation of the entire battlefield through the spiders, and then relaying orders to each of them. Olan had never fought a battle like this before, nor had he learned anything about it. But there was no doubt that this was what he had been dreaming of. He could clearly see that his opponents were unable to resist and were in shock and fear. All they needed to do was to move forward, and victory would be within their grasp. It was as if they were their own arms. Olan had always thought that this was just an adjective, but now he realized that this kind of command and execution really existed. The night officers on the battlefield had truly gathered together to form a sharp sword, and the person wielding the sword was a peerless swordsman. What a satisfying battle. But suddenly, a few wind spirit spiders appeared out of thin air around him. When Olan saw these sky-blue translucent insects in the wind, he immediately knew that they were the scouts in his direction. Something went wrong. Cruz's men are already on the move, Brando replied with a serious face as if he had seen it with his own eyes. There are at least 3 or more armies moving towards our flanks from the northeast and northwest. They are moving very fast. They have passed by the Avenue of the Golden Fleece, the 12th Avenue. He suddenly raised his head. I think I recognize them. It's the White Lion Legion. This is their old trick of attacking from 2 sides. Brando suddenly found it funny. It was actually them. They want to outflank us. Maynard coldly replied, "This is a trap. Those northerners are quite brave. They attracted everyone's attention to the Black Blade Squad, but secretly mobilized the White Lion Squad." Brando sneered as he raised his head and looked at the strange phenomenon of the divine weapon resonating in the sky. It's just to satisfy Cruz's demands. He doesn't even feel the slightest bit of heartache. Everyone's face darkened. The situation now was very clear. The king's eldest son must have used the Lionheart sword as a bargaining chip to convince the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Otherwise, under the surveillance of the Kurlutz, the White Lion Legion would not have been able to quietly transfer thousands of people to Ampere Seal. Not only that, Cypher had openly persuaded Cruz's men to come personally. In fact, whether the Lionheart sword appeared in Ampere Seal or not, it would belong to the Holy Cathedral of Fire in the future. With the manpower and resources of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, it would be easy to find a sword in the small Erewhon. Not to mention the other party had several other parts that could resonate with the Lionheart sword. But perhaps the other party did not expect Oderfice's soul to be in the White Lion Legion all this time. Perhaps this was the so-called man proposes, God disposes. The sudden resonance of the divine weapon also reminded Brando. Would. Brando could not help but shake his head. He was still too reliant on the judgment of his previous life. That old man Wood was indeed a close friend of Tumen and was also an upright and neutral person. But other than that, he had forgotten that Wood was also a high-ranking member of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, a Kurlutzian. The importance of the flaming blade Oderfice to the Holy Cathedral of Fire was self-evident. More importantly, the Holy War was as important to him as it was to Moros. Those northerners were really patient. But unfortunately they gave him a last chance. The resonance of the divine weapon had exposed his position, but it also exposed the other party's intentions. Brando could not help but be sarcastic. The Holy Cathedral of Fire still did not understand that the battlefield was already under his control. Soon the other party would regret it. He turned around. "Maynard, please order the army to turn around. This is our last chance." The female knight looked up and glanced at him. She nodded silently. The sound of a horn could be heard. Alon tightened his grip on the reins. He could already hear the sound of the horn echoing in the air. This was not an attack but a retreat. But now he had no choice. He saw the soldiers in grayish-white armor pouring out from the alleys in front and behind him. The kingdom's White Lion Legion. Alon felt his heart tighten, but he reacted quickly. "It's an ambush. Go into that alley." At this time, the 5 NCOs and knights displayed exquisite coordination. They pulled on the reins at the same time, turned around and clamped on the horse's belly at the same time. Then they turned around and jumped into the side of the alley. "Faster! Faster! Don't stop!" But soon Alon saw the same soldiers appear at the other end of the alley. They seemed to be heavy infantry and there were 2 rows of about 10 of them. He immediately shouted, "The White Lion Legion is infantry. Speed up, charge through them." But the White Lion Legion reacted quickly. As soon as they appeared at the entrance of the alley, they set up tower shields in front and spears in the back. The spears they were using were the special equipment of the White Lion Legion. They were modified from the Wind Elves' dragon-slaying spears, and were very effective against cavalry. Alon's heart sank. The enemy's tactics were too good. He wished he was riding on Cruz's dragon. Only the dragon's armor plate, which was more than 7 millimeters thick, could withstand a blow from the White Lion Legion's spears. He turned around and saw the White Lion Legion charging into the alley. The one leading the charge was a White Lion Legion with a heavy shield in one hand and a battle axe in the other. The White Lion Legion's light infantry had already raised their longbows. Alon finally realized that the rain had stopped, and the projectile weapons were finally put to use. This was one disaster after another. Alon turned around and squinted his eyes. The rows of White Lion Legion spears were getting closer and closer. The patterns on the spears were clear, but they were slightly different from the ones he saw in the north. Did the White Lion Legion improve their weapons again? The White Lion Legion was indeed the best in the kingdom. But they were not inferior to the White Lion Legion in any way. It was just that they were at a great disadvantage. "Let's make a last stand." Alon tightened his grip on his sword. The White Lion light infantry behind him had already let go of their bowstrings. The sharp sound of arrows piercing through the air could be heard from afar. Then Olan felt a few heavy impacts on his back. It hurt a little, but fortunately he did not wear it. But his aim was terrible. He was glad that the White Lion Legion was not known for their long-range attacks. Olan had regretted this more than once, but now that the White Lion Legion was on his opposite side, he was glad that he did not jinx it. But the spears were getting closer and closer. Put in more effort, brothers. He suddenly raised the sword in his hand and roared with all his remaining strength. For Erwin, forward. The knight beside him roared. But at that moment Olan heard a faint voice shouting, "Split up! Split up! Split up what?" He was stunned. Suddenly he saw the White Lion Legion's light infantry moving to the sides, creating a gap in the middle. Chance. Olan was like a drowning man who had found a straw. He immediately screamed like the knight who had charged at the enemy during the Battle of Grimoires. Charge! Charge! No one wanted to die if they could. The officers were the same. Although they did not understand why the White Lion Legion had given them a chance, they had no other choice. The 5 war horses and the knight on their backs passed through the White Lion Legion's spear formation in an instant. Olan turned around and saw the spear formation closing up behind them. Then he saw the White Lion Legion's light infantry on the other side of the alley. They were drawing their bows again and releasing arrows. When he saw the sharp arrows leave the bowstrings, he suddenly realized something. It was not that the White Lion Legion's aim was bad. They were aiming at the White Lion Legion's light infantry. What was going on? Had the White Lion Legion split up? Olan's mind was in a mess. Then he heard a voice calling out to him. Olan. He turned around and saw a large group of students from the Royal Cavalry Academy gathered together, forming a torrent of cavalry. The female knight on horseback stared at him and shouted, "Olan, get back to the team. We don't have time to talk, we have to break through to the south." Bess, what's going on here? Olan looked back at the White Lion Legion's light infantry. They were fighting with their comrades, but to his surprise, the White Lion Legion's light infantry were no match for the light infantry that had appeared later. When he saw the White Lion infantrymen blocking the entrance of the alleyway, he couldn't help but change his expression. White Raven swordsmanship. Could it be that these are the Royal Guards? No, I don't know. Bess shook her head. They're here to help us, but I don't know what's going on. She tilted her head. If you have any questions you can ask the commander. Commander? Olan turned around on his horse and immediately saw a slender figure standing upright on a warhorse. He could not help but look in that direction with reverence. Is that also the commander's army? It seems so. But how can he command the White Lion Legion? No, Olan. They're not the White Lion Legion. In fact, they're... The White Lion Legion. The half-elf princess froze in place. She watched as the army walked out of the heavy rain and arrived in front of her. They then passed through her troops and entered the front line of the battlefield. Her fingertips had turned white and were even trembling slightly. Countless times she had heard her father talk about this army in bedtime stories. They wore pure white armor and fought alongside the late king in the plains, mountains and forests of Erewhon. They defeated all their enemies and expanded their territory. They walked with virtue and valor. They were the strongest army that truly belonged to Erewhon. The White Lion Legion. Countless times she saw the shining flag in her dreams. Under the lead of her knight it came to her. And that glorious army seemed to have returned to Erewhon and returned to the flag. Countless times she even thought that her father was still alive in this world and could see her achieve everything with his own eyes. Countless times she believed that she could succeed. Until her father, who had always supported her, left her. Until the royal faction parted ways with her ideals. But today her dreams had become reality. The flag was right in front of her. Behind Brando. That army was currently walking under the flag. They were clad in pure white armor, and golden battle flags were engraved on their armor. There was not the slightest difference. When she saw that the army had defeated the White Lion Legion's attack, the half-fairy princess could not help but look up at the sky. At that moment she seemed to have seen the wise eyes that had transcended time. Brando did not expect that the army he had built with his own hands would have such a great impact on the princess. But how could he not be the same? Recreating this army was one of his dreams. But when he saw the birth of this army with his own eyes, he realized that his efforts had not been in vain. The ancient army had returned. It was as if the king had personally handed it to him. Only Erewhon's people could understand the meaning behind it. But Brando knew that this was not the time to be sentimental. The White Lion Legion was still preparing to complete the encirclement. He only had one chance. He had to break out of the encirclement. He had to take everyone with him. He glanced around. The Knight Academy students had already gathered. These young people did not suffer any losses in the battle against the Coast Guards. But when the White Lion Legion attacked, almost 1/10 of them would be forever left on the battlefield. They were still too young. Brando's heart ached so much that he could barely speak. Fortunately, most of the heroes in history were fine. Only a few of them were slightly injured. The funniest thing was that Enrique actually fell off his horse when he broke through the White Lion Legion's blockade and was crushed to death. If not for his companions who came to his rescue, he would probably have become a captive. Thank goodness. Brando turned around and gave Carglass a look. The current commander of the new White Lion Legion immediately nodded. Brando wanted the new White Lion Legion to protect the students on both sides. This did not mean that he did not care about the lives of the new White Lion Legion. It was because he believed that there was no possibility of these young people from Tanajul dying. Everything was arranged properly. The new White Lion Legion and the Royal Cavalry Academy's cadets were indeed Aween's most outstanding troops in this era. It took less than a quarter of an hour for the two armies to merge and turn around. Brando raised his sword. He looked proudly at the White Lion Legion in the distance. Finally, his battle plan was going to be realized. He would let the White Lion Legion be the first test subject. Although it was not complete, it was enough to give some people a hard time. Everyone looked up at the Haurangaya that was pointed to the sky. At that moment, a golden halo spread out from Brando's body. Conflict Halo. Brando put down his sword and pointed forward. Charge. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 586. The sunlight reflected off the ivory white Lionheart Street of Ampere Seal. This street was built in the year of the dead moon, Chaos. 1437. The Archbishop of Ampere Seal, Charlemagne, wrote the following: "The long street shines like snow, like a holy staircase leading to the clouds." 465 years ago, the White Lion Legion had once been inspected by King Eric on this very street. Today, however, they had once again appeared on this land. Their spears shone and their armor was as white as snow. The enemy is here. Sir Franz stood at the temporary position and looked at the rows of silver spears appearing on the horizon at the other end of Lionheart Street. The corners of his mouth drooped slightly and a cold light flashed in his eyes. If the enemy is the White Lion Legion, why should I? Cullen's failure was still in front of him. He slowly raised his right hand and clasped his fingers together. However, Cullen was just a piece of trash. The White Lion Legion's motto was, "Do not rest until death." However, no matter who the enemy was, the Legion would lose. Whether it was true or false, the sword would reveal itself. This was a sharp blade stained with blood. Praises were not empty words. Sir Franz looked up at the battle flag of the White Lion Legion. This was a fortress built with the blood of the enemy and his own. However, young people would never understand. He never thought that there would be an army in the kingdom that could defeat the White Lion Legion today. Other legions could not even the White Lion Guards of the past. Denying today was a betrayal of history. Sir Franz would never forget his comrades who died in the November War. Their blood would not be spilled in vain. Today he would use swords and longbows to prove all of this. From today onwards, the White Lion Legion would stand on this land forever. Their flag would never fade because of this. How could the fate of today's people be bound by history? Not everyone had to live a heavy life for the sake of carrying yesterday's ideals. Just existing was a kind of pride. History was based on strength. Ready? A command with a thick accent from the northern highlands came in the wind. Behind Sir Franz, the light infantrymen of the White Lion Legion took a step forward like a gray-white human wall. They raised their longbows one by one, and the iron horns on the bows shone under the sunlight, forming a swaying, flashing belt of light. The commander narrowed his eyes and estimated the distance. The archers of the White Lion Legion held their breaths and adjusted their heartbeats to synchronize their hands and eyes. The commanding officer finally nodded. 100 steps away, no wind. 100 steps away, no wind. Sir Franz raised his hand high as if it were a flag and waved it violently before him. Release. Buzz. The air seemed to have been sucked out and the bowstring seemed to be vibrating at an extremely low frequency. The 300 White Lion Legion archers released their arrows at the same time. Then they slowly turned their bodies and pulled out another arrow from the quiver on their backs. In an instant, arrows flew through the sky like locusts. Wang Li Knight Academy's young non-commissioned officer's eyes followed the arrow as it flew higher, the orderly cavalry formation producing ripples like water ripples. Brando looked on coldly from the sidelines. Having experienced many wars, he knew that perhaps in every war, a concentrated volley of longbows was not the method of attack that caused the most casualties, but it was a huge test of the quality of the army. Erwin had many examples that when faced with concentrated long-range attacks, the morale of a low-quality army would plummet. This was because people would always instinctively seek to escape from a predicament. Timidity and eagerness would tear apart the formation, and even lead to disarray. But war was a process of overcoming instincts. Maintain the speed. Maintain the speed. Mock, Breton, and even Loka shouted at the top of their lungs. The non-commissioned officers steered their horses and raised their small shields. Kinmer took a light breath on the back of his horse. His grayish-brown eyes stared at the arrows that were flying higher and higher in the sky, and his head was raised higher and higher. Although they had experienced a few battles before, this was the first time they were thrown into a real battle. There were no tactical requirements for the battle between the two sides, and it was a competition of pure fighting spirit. Their opponents were no longer the weak coast guards. Instead, they were the kingdom's White Lion Legion who wore grayish-white armor. They looked solemn and moved in unison. The most elite warriors of the kingdom, swoosh, the rain of arrows was already upon them. All the knight on horseback leaned back slightly, and the arrows clanged as they fell from their bodies. The arrows were slightly deformed before they even got close to them. A layer of invisible golden light extended in the direction of the arrows. When the arrows broke through the halo and hit everyone, they had already lost most of their strength. It's magic. It's the conflict halo? There's a Templar knight in the enemy camp. The White Lion Legion shouted. The moment Mare was hit by an arrow, his mind went blank. But when he shook his head and looked up, he saw that amidst the rain of arrows, the infantry regiment in white armor at the front of the army was separating from the main group. They were withstanding the countless arrows. They were attracting the enemy's firepower. Kinmer swallowed a mouthful of saliva. Suddenly he felt that his throat was a little dry. Brando held his long sword and fixed his gaze on the northern nobles. He was waiting for an opportunity, and the opportunity was right in front of him. He finally raised his sword and roared as if he was using all his strength. White Lion Legion, listen to my command. Crush all your enemies. You were born with glory, so spread your wings and embrace the victory that belongs to you. No matter who the enemy is, the Legion will win. The Haurangaya was pointed to the sky like a flag flying in the wind. The White Lion Legion roared in unison. This roar shook the heavens and the earth, causing the faces of their enemies to change color. In just a dozen seconds, the longbowmen of the White Lion Legion had already shot 4 rounds of arrows. The flying arrows were like a storm that swept through every inch of land within 100 meters. Although the White Lion Legion was not good at long-range attacks, that was only relatively speaking. It was meaningless. Sir Franz looked at the Holy White Army in shock. The White Lion Legion was advancing courageously in the rain of arrows. All the firepower was focused on them, but to no avail. Even the sharpest arrows could not get within a foot of their bodies. A layer of pale green light naturally bounced off the arrows. The archers switched to hunting arrows and armor-piercing arrows, but none of them were effective. On the contrary, the enemy was gradually accelerating. They were faster than galloping horses. Sir Franz's body was cold. He had seen Cruz's Broken Sword Legion on the plateau and Saint Tassol's Stag Guards in the November War. The army in front of him made him feel as if he had returned to that nightmarish era. Less than 1 in 10 survived. The blood that flowed from the war seemed to have dyed his vision red. Let the mages attack. Sir Franz almost gritted his teeth as he shouted. His forehead was covered in a thin layer of cold sweat. Sir, the mages are still behind. Sir Franz led the White Lion Legion's Jude Legion's 1st Swordsman Legion. The purpose of this light infantry regiment was to take a detour to the back of the princess's party and cut off their escape route. He led a column of archers and a column of light infantry to their destination first. They did not even have time to rest before they got into formation. He originally thought that 500 people would be more than enough to stop 200 people from the enemy. But now he only felt regret. He had underestimated the enemy. Sir Franz closed his eyes. Quick, let the great knight Nicoloma come and help. Let the holy cathedral come and help. Damn it, why is there a Templar knight in the enemy's camp? Those damn Cruz people, they're going back on their words. He turned around. But they had to stop the enemy even if it meant that they had to pay a price. Archers, back off and change to long swords. White Lion infantry, forward. Behind the archers, spears appeared like a forest. But it was too late. The White Lion Legion had already reached the front of the camp. This army, which seemed to have walked out of a legend, was about to spread their wings and embrace their victory. The green lines that encircled their armor seemed to have come to life. They circled around each other and stretched out to both sides. In an instant, a pair of green wings with a wingspan of nearly 10 meters appeared on the backs of the White Lion Legion's warriors. Ah! The infantrymen of the White Lion Legion who had just raised their spears were dumbfounded when they saw their enemies suddenly leave the ground. It was not flying, but it was even more terrifying than flying. They leapt high into the air and crossed a distance of nearly 20 meters in a single leap, arriving above the White Lion Legion's camp in an instant. Isn't this the Wind Elves' tactic? When Sir Franz raised his head, his mind was blank. This was the last thought in his life. In the air, spears rained down like rain. One of the spears had unparalleled power, piercing through his heart before he could even react. Even at the moment of his death, the leader of the White Lion Legion's first Swordsman Legion still had a look of shock on his face. Unwillingness. There was also disbelief. The White Lion Legion left behind a sea of corpses as they retreated. However, they were not retreating. Instead, they were forming an encirclement. The lower-ranked officers took over Sir Franz's command. Although their morale was greatly reduced, they still had to complete the Legion's final mission. The White Lion Legion would not rest until they were dead. Carglass was also troubled by this scene. The White Lion Legion may not be the strongest army in the kingdom, but it was definitely the most difficult to deal with. The White Lion Legion's glory supported them and they would not retreat. However, they only had one chance. They could not let the enemy entangle them. More than 3 swordsman legions of the White Lion Legion were surrounding them. If they were a second late, it would be the difference between heaven and hell. When he and his knight landed on the ground, they immediately made the same decision: to advance. They had to break through the enemy's camp and open up a path for the Knight Legionnaires behind them. The young men from Tonagel did not care about anything else. However, they were facing an equally fearless opponent. Their powerful swordsmanship could only cause waves of blood in the crowd. However, this was not enough. It was far from enough. Carglass unsheathed the blade of the lion and roared with bloodshot eyes, "Push them away. Even if you have to run into them, you have to open up a path for me. Listen up. You can only move forward, no retreat." Everyone's eyes were bloodshot. The White Lion Legion had completely given up on defense, only advancing and not retreating in the sea of people. Although the White Lion Legion's attacks were unable to cause any damage to them, the soldiers who had no hesitation clung onto their arms and legs one after another, preventing them from moving forward. Carglass single-handedly took on the attacks of more than 10 people. Even though it was just a short fight, he felt like he had reached his limit. He was panting heavily, and the white steam he exhaled condensed under the mask of his helmet. The White Lion Legion also began to suffer casualties. Finally, someone was pinned down by the White Lion Legion and pierced to the ground with a sword. However, this did not come without a price. The White Lion Legion's first swordsman regiment finally began to weaken. Kenmare suddenly heard cheers. He looked around and saw that the cavalry formation was spreading out to the sides, forming a thinner and wider charging formation. It's about to start, he suddenly thought. As expected, the 2 flanking squads of knight were speeding up. They raised their flags high and took the lead. Mare recognized the knight. It was the female Silver Elf Knight and the red-haired Miss Devil. The Highlanders believed that red-haired people had the blood of the devil in them, and Kenmare was no exception. Moreover, Scarlet's fighting style was not elegant. Mercenaries were known for their ferocity in battle. Next were Count Yenbao's 3 knights. Mare could not help but linger on the female knight. Following closely behind were Bragg's Breton, Senior Loca, and the cold-faced Moke. Under their leadership, the cavalry formed a crescent shape, and gradually increased in speed from a trot to a gallop where they kept their mounts. The ground began to tremble and rumble like thunder. Mare heard someone shouting in his ears. "Speed up! Speed up! We have entered the enemy's best shooting range. Don't stop if you don't want to die. Cavalry, speed up. Maintain formation." Before Mare could react, he felt someone bump into him. He turned around and saw a black figure brushing past him. He looked up and saw a black cloak fluttering in the wind, as well as the pitch-black broad blade that was raised high in the air. The Haurangaya. It was the commander. That was how the officers addressed him. Mare could not help but widen his eyes. Was he going to join the charge as well? In their impression, Brando was a strategist commander, not a knight in the vanguard. But just as he opened his mouth in surprise, he saw another slender figure walking side by side with the commander. It was Sir Oberway. The lone wolf's name had long been known throughout the kingdom. The old minister of the kingdom, Oberway, was actually going to charge side by side with him? What kind of glory was this? But who was the one honoring who? Before Mare could make a sound, one knight after another had passed him to Brando's side. First was the knight of the mercenaries of Lopez. These experienced mercenaries clustered around their leader, making Brando look like a hunting king. Brando quickly used practical actions to answer the doubts in Mare's heart. The kingdom's first swordsman legion's formation was finally loosening. The opportunity had come. Brando retracted his gaze. On his left were Oberway and Maynard, and on his right were the Shire, the Nightsong Tiger, Andrique, and Mephistopheles. These people were his companions. So-called companions. They were all like-minded people. He knew that some of these people had gone through thick and thin with him in this world, and some of them had fought side by side with him in another history. But at this moment the two histories seemed to overlap. It was close at hand no matter how one looked at it. The wind whistled past his ear, and there seemed to be a sound in the wind. It was the sound of a Karsuk flute. The sound of the flute floated above the battlefield. That year the enemy they faced was the endless army of Madara. Just like now, right in front of them, the knight put on their helmets, told each other to take care, and was about to launch the final charge against the enemy. What awaited them were countless cold, emotionless deaths that leaped like phosphorescence. At that moment history and reality overlapped. Then it was time to charge. He raised his sword and took the lead. His cloak fluttered like a black flame. Bucci, Fortress Reeden, Madara. Everything was left behind, and in front of him was an endless future. History had changed. The cavalry roared behind him, forming 3 unstoppable arrows. Their names were the Royal Knight Academy students. Their names were the kingdom's White Lion Guards. Their names were Erwin's young future. On the battlefield, when the huge trident pierced the White Lion Legion's formation, this supposedly indestructible legion finally collapsed. The cavalry howled, and the long sound of the horn was like a large hand that swept across the battlefield, carrying everyone's victory forward and forward. A hole was broken in the encirclement of the White Lion Legion. This hole finally tore apart the darkest corner of Erwin's history. When the great knight Nicoloma arrived with reinforcements, he saw a corner of the White Lion Legion collapsing with a pale face. This was a scene he had never seen in his life. Then he saw a black flame sweep out from the defeated soldiers. Under the flame, it was the young man's steel-like eyes and the sharp blade in his hand. Head Knight Nicoloma unsheathed his long sword. What a holy night! A circle of yellow light began to spread out from his body. He was also a Templar Knight. Mare saw with his own eyes that their commander crossed paths with the Knight of the Holy Cathedral. He did not even have time to warn him. That was a Templar Knight of the Holy Cathedral. He even recognized him as Nicoloma, the great Knight of Ampere Seal, one of the few gold-ranked experts of the Holy Cathedral. But all Mare saw was a continuous shadow, and the head of the great knight flew high into the air. Ah! He could not even make a sound? All the students of the Royal Knight Academy were completely stunned at this moment. What kind of swordsmanship was that? It could not be described in the words of mortals. The first swordsman regiment of the White Lion Legion collapsed. The battlefield seemed to have formed a whirlpool of death. The men of the great knight Nicoloma were also swept into this whirlpool and were crushed in an instant. However, Brando was still moving forward. The young cavalry swept past the flank of the 3rd Swordsman Regiment of the White Lion Legion, and then swept past the 4th Swordsman Regiment that had just arrived. Kong In died in battle, and Owen was seriously injured. The morale was high. Ampere Seal's North Gate Barracks. Balta looked at the report in his hand with a pale face. All the information on it told him only one thing. The princess and her subordinates of the Royal Knight Academy had broken out of the encirclement. He raised his head stiffly. Archbishop Wood's face was gloomy. The growth of the young people is far beyond our expectations. It seems that we have to let the old guys take action. Leiter nodded, turned and pushed the door open. P.S. My cousin gave birth to a baby yesterday. She went to visit her today and only rushed back in the afternoon to write this chapter. Hee, I can't believe I'm an uncle too. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 587. This was originally the largest wool market in the east of the port of Ampere Seal, but the previous battle had turned it into ruins. There were many defeated soldiers gathered in the ruins. The coast guards and the nobles' private soldiers were arguing, while the White Lion Legion looked on coldly. Your Excellency, the Holy Cathedral will not interfere in the internal affairs of other countries. This is not out of arrogance, but because the Holy Cathedral does not want to be influenced by secular power. The Holy Bible and the Holy Covenant clearly state this principle. I think you should understand this point. Count Vidokin adjusted his helmet and let his attendants put on his armor. However, his beard and hair were burnt, which damaged his dignified appearance and made him look a little funny. He had escaped from the Amberlight Cathedral with Duke Cypher, and the injuries on his body were also from the fire. When he turned the armor on his arm, a burst of burning pain made him grimace. But Your Excellency, isn't punishing evil also one of your priorities? What's more, the other party is an evil heretic, an enemy of mankind who preaches chaos. Of course, the Holy Cathedral will not sit by and watch our country fall into suffering and ignore it, the voice replied with some amusement. However, the physical pain was nothing compared to the piercing pain in the soul. The power that came from the ultimate realm was frightening. In order to suppress the flame of sin, the ash sword Saint Mephisto had pulled Moros into the ashen wilderness. However, that final glance caused everyone present to feel a chill in their hearts. Royalty, title, they were all useless in the face of true power. The Holy Cathedral was high and mighty, but they still had to bow their heads in the face of the ultimate law. Vidokin looked at his pale palms, which were still trembling slightly. He raised his head and looked not far away. Duke Cypher's famous swordsman, Nicholas, was negotiating with the Holy Cathedral under his master's signal. Then I would like to ask on behalf of the Duke, what do you intend to do? Let's put it this way. We were invited by the new royal family of Erewhon to arrest Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles. This person has killed the high-ranking members of the Holy Cathedral and is a vicious outlaw. In addition, we're here to bring back the sacred relic of the Holy Cathedral, the Flame King Gadol's sacred relic, a fragment of the Holy Sword Odorfice. The priest in the priest's robe rambled on for a long time. The general meaning was, we will help you deal with Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles and fight against the cultists, but you have to solve your own domestic problems. He was a typical Kurlutzian, with his chin held high and haughty, as if you country bumpkins should be grateful for it. Duke Cypher didn't say a word. His face was terrifyingly dark, but he didn't dare to flare up. As early as after Oberg VI, the nobles of Erewhon gradually fell. People even forgot that Erewhon used to have masters of the ultimate realm. The late King Eric was a sage of his generation. During the Second Restoration era, it was said that Erewhon used to have two sword saints of the ultimate realm, and the chief court wizard was the famous Tulman. But after that the glory never returned. Nicholas' face was also cold. Those cultists are with Her Royal Highness. So what? The priest pondered for a moment. Lord Wood said that we can build a temporary teleportation circle for you to send the Black Blade Squad to the battlefield. This is already the limit. If we build a teleportation circle here, there will be one less teleportation circle in the future in the Holy War. You know, even in crews, such a teleportation circle is only used to send elite troops. As for such a third-rate troop, to be honest, it's a waste. But for our allies, we can sacrifice them. Nicholas' face was terrifyingly dark. He interrupted, I understand. Thank you for the support of the Holy Cathedral. But when does the Holy Cathedral plan to make a move? We'll be here soon. The means of the Holy Cathedral are beyond the imagination of ordinary people. The priest opened his arms and replied with a look of admiration. Everyone just wait for the show. Oh, it's already here. All of a sudden, the sounds of quarreling above the ruins stopped at the same time. The monks of the Holy Cathedral of Fire in their red robes raised their heads at the same time. In midair, as far as their eyes could see, the space opened from both sides and pure white ripples appeared. In the middle of the ripples, the incomparably complex and mysterious lines of law were opening a door of light. The wind above the ruins stopped in an instant. There were a total of 12 light gates suspended in midair. Then a three-layered magic array extended out from the light gates. Accompanied by fluttering white runes, 20 mysterious people wearing golden red robes and silver masks stepped out from the light gates. Each of them held a flame-shaped longsword in their hands. If Brando was here, he would definitely recognize these Knights of the Holy Cathedral of Judgment. This was one of the most special organizations of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Each of these knights was personally trained by a real Knight of the Flame. Their true combat power was often far superior to most powerhouses of the same level. The most important thing was that they often only had one mission, and that was the trial of heresy. Count Vidokin raised his head and looked at these Knights of the Holy Cathedral. Spatial spells. This was the highest forbidden spell that the Holy Cathedral of Fire claimed to have led to the Infinite Land. These spells, born in the War of the Holy Saints, had long been the top secret of the major holy cathedrals, and were the few remaining spatial spells in vaunt today. It was the first time he had seen such a miracle with his own eyes. When he saw the Cruz Empire's Holy Cathedral of Fire send 20 knights of the Holy Cathedral of Fire from the headquarters to the battlefield thousands of miles away, he only felt his mind go blank. As a soldier, he knew very well what this meant. This was truly invincible power. But he had even forgotten that Erewhon's people had faced such power head-on and won a glorious victory. At that time, the Holy Cathedral was even more powerful, and Erewhon had just established his country. He was like a baby in swaddling clothes. Vidokin only felt a shiver and even a trace of regret. It would be easy for these knights of the Holy Cathedral to seize Erewhon's power. Could these nobles really hold on to their power? Until the sound of footsteps stepping on stones and debris sounded behind him, he was awakened. Vidokin turned around and saw a white-haired old knight walking over with his hands on the hilt of his sword. 2 other knights accompanied him. The old knight was wearing a slightly faded dark blue cavalry uniform. It was the old commander of the White Lion Legion, Leiter. The old man was also looking up at the sky. The count hurriedly stood up and wanted to say hello, but the old man did not even look at him and walked straight past him. Vidokin's face suddenly turned red and white. This old man really looked down on them. He secretly gritted his teeth and cursed. Although the White Lion Legion was the best in the kingdom, so what? They still couldn't protect the Lionheart sword. You're a whore and you still want to maintain your chastity. Bah! What's so great about that? He tore away the gentleness of a noble in his heart and could not help but curse fiercely. This dissatisfaction was expressed on the count's face as he snorted disdainfully. But Leiter did not seem to hear. The old man seemed to be thinking. He gently pressed the ivy pattern on the hilt of his sword. It was a 32-year-old cavalry sword, and the ivy pattern on the sword was almost worn flat. Since that war, this sword had been with him for half a century. Every time he wore this sword, it would remind him of the era when the wind blew on the plateau. Everything in the past was gone with the wind. The young people of the White Lion Legion were still arguing. Even the child, Cullen, was crying and begging him to take the White Lion Legion away from here and leave this sad place. A soldier must have the courage to face death and grief. Those children gave their best answers when faced with a choice. They illustrated the value of the White Lion Legion. But should the White Lion Legion lose their faith? The old man no longer had the energy to care. His eyes were burning with a deep and firm flame, as if supporting the last trace of strength of this old body. He stared ahead for a long time. The kingdom or the Lionheart sword? The late king, there is not much time left for the people of Erewhon to make a choice. The holy war is imminent. Madara is watching from the side of the bed. Erewhon must not fall into a long-term civil strife. Death is in sight. And this land, this homeland where the blood of the ancestors was spilled, was the land that carried the dreams of the people of Erewhon. As long as this land existed, Erewhon would see the light again one day. He was too old, and the White Lion Legion was just like him, aging day by day. He was so old that he could no longer carry the flag. But no matter what, he still wanted to try his best. Hope should be left to the future generations. Someone had to bear the responsibility. Your Highness, Marshal, it seems like this is all I can do. The students of the Royal Knight Academy and the White Lion Legion finally fought their way out of the encirclement of the northern nobles, but this did not mean that the crisis was over. Everyone knew that there was still a large number of coast guards ahead. Today's life and death were uncertain. At this time, Brendel ordered everyone to dismount and slowly advance along the streets, conserving their strength. They were passing through Tafas Square, which was on the same axis as the Anderla Cathedral and the Grand Auction House. It was the middle line of the west of Ampere Seal Port. Maynard was a little worried about the speed of the army. She was worried that the White Lion Legion would catch up from behind. But when she asked Brando this question with a cold face, Brando shook his head. "No, do you know how many people the White Lion Legion has mobilized to kill us?" he asked quietly. The female knight was slightly stunned. She lowered her head and made a rough estimate. In the first battle, they had encountered and defeated about 4 columns of enemies. Each column had about 200 to 300 people. But they had cut through the line of defense of the White Lion Legion. There must be more troops on both sides. She was worried that these troops would catch up from behind. Brando saw the hesitation on the female knight's face. He shook his head and explained, "The White Lion Legion has Jude, Sharp Claw, and Lion's Mane. There is also a knight regiment called White Lion Blade. In the past there was also a guard regiment, but it was later disbanded. Brando glanced at his own White Lion Legion and continued, considering that it is unlikely that the White Lion Legion would really mobilize a legion to leave the border, it is very likely that the ones participating in the battle are elites from one of the legions. In the previous battle we encountered 2 columns of Franz's troops. They should be the archers and light infantry of the 1st Swordsman Regiment of the White Lion Legion. The light cavalry squadron that was defeated later should be a knight regiment of the Holy Cathedral and the cavalry scouts of the 3rd Swordsman Regiment of the White Lion Legion. The unlucky guy you killed was their commander, Khan? Brendel couldn't help but shake his head when he saw that the female knight was slightly taken aback. She seemed a little surprised, but it wasn't obvious from her cold expression. In fact, Khan was quite famous in history. It was a pity that he died just like that. However, there were always casualties in war, so he could only think so. The defensive line formed by the White Lion Heavy Guards that we broke through in the end was clearly another troop. Considering that the Jude Guards are made up of 4 swordsman regiments and 2 heavy infantry regiments, it is very likely that we have half of the Jude Guards in front of us. That is, 2 swordsman regiments and 1 heavy infantry regiment. Am I right, Sir Oberway? Brando turned around and asked. The lone wolf of the kingdom nodded and looked at Brando with some surprise. Before Erwin's resurgence in Griffin, one of the major drawbacks of the military system was that there was no unified organization. Often the rules were set by the nobles and lords. The major legions also had their own system, such as the northern and southern legions. Therefore, even if they were both soldiers, they might not necessarily know the organization of the other legions. Needless to say, it was impossible for Brando to know the origin of the enemy, who they belonged to, and who their commander was. In fact, this was a common phenomenon in the continent of Vaunt in this era. In a war, commanders could only barely determine which army they were facing by judging flags, capturing prisoners, and so on. Because of this, there were countless mistakes, and there were a few famous generals in history who used this factor to create many classic examples of battles. However, history was like a torrent. Cruz and Madara's military reforms had already begun, and soon it would open a new chapter. The era of war after the great demonic tide was coming. Although Erwin was on the last train, in the end he disappeared under the dust of history because the reforms were not thorough enough. Brando looked at the people present. Most of them were soldiers. The sergeants were originally trained as low-level officers, and they were the seeds of Erwin's reforms. Like Oberway, they knew how unbelievable Brando's previous judgment was. Everyone was a little disapproving. How could one guess the enemy's sequence on the battlefield? It was not that there were no such arrogant commanders in history, but there were many who fell into the trap because of this, and there were even some famous examples that were passed down through the ages. But after seeing Oberway nod in agreement with Brando's answer, they felt a little complicated. The commander was very confident, and naturally it was not a fluke, so there was only one possibility left. How do you know? It was rare for Maynel to open her mouth and ask on behalf of everyone else. Brando smiled, because I am familiar with every army of Erwin. I know very well what they will do and how they will do it. He answered this way not because he wanted to pretend to be a prophet. It was because he had to show such confidence because he was the only one who could lead them out of here. He knew very well that he had to show enough confidence to convince everyone. You said that you are familiar with every army of Erwin? A soft but calm voice asked. Brando looked up and saw Her Highness in military attire. His eyes could not help but light up slightly. He then remembered that Griffin was never a flower raised by the royal family, and her swordsmanship had always been the best among her peers. She must have participated in the previous charge. He even saw the sword on the half-elf girl's waist and the bloodstains that had not completely dried up on her face. She turned around and stared at him with her silver eyes. Her silver curly hair hung down on the dark blue woolen military uniform, and the tailored uniform seemed to fit every line of her body. It was really refreshing. Brando then realized that she had been wearing this military uniform from the beginning. No wonder she wore a thick cloak to cover it up and looked a little bloated. But when Her Highness asked the question, her tone was a little strange. Brando hesitated for a moment. It seemed that it was not impossible to say that he was familiar with every army. He had lived in Erwin for nearly a century, and during that time he had fought side by side with many armies, including the private armies of the nobles. But this answer seemed a little too unbelievable, and it seemed a little omniscient. You can't say that. Brando thought for a while and replied carefully, at least I should be familiar with the uniforms of the regular army. He noticed that Princess Griffin had a strange look on her face, and he turned around to exchange an inexplicable look with Oberway. "Oh no, it seems a little too much." But Brando could only continue. He thought for a while and replied, "So the conclusion is very obvious. According to the kingdom's White Lion Legion, a swordsman regiment should have 3 light infantry columns, 1 archer column, and an additional mage squadron and scout squadron, a total of 1,100 people. The heavy infantry regiment is half of it, so I estimate that the White Lion Legion on this battlefield is probably less than 3,000 people." When he said this, Maynard already understood what he meant. The White Lion Legion had less than 3,000 people, and in the previous battle, nearly 1/3 of them had been severely injured. An army that had lost more than 30% of its members in a battle and still had not collapsed was already impressive. It would be ridiculous to say that they could continue to pursue. Not to mention that Brando had more than double digits of gold rankers in his hands. Even if the White Lion Legion fought with all their might, they might not be able to win. But they might not just watch us leave, right? Maynard raised her long eyelashes and silently glanced at Brando. "Yes, so we have to come up with a new plan now." "A new plan?" Brando nodded. It was obvious that there was more than that on the battlefield. The key was Cruz's people. The princess seemed to have thought of the same thing. She raised her head and asked, "Is it because of Cruz's people?" "Due to the deterrence of the Holy Bible and the Sacred Covenant, Cruz's people and the Holy Cathedral of Fire probably won't intervene personally, but they can find a way to help our enemies." Brando silently recalled the methods of the Holy Cathedral of Fire as he replied, "Since Cruz's people are here, they are definitely not here to treat us to tea. Besides, we are the masters of this place. If anyone wants to treat, it should be us." He was still in the mood to joke, causing a low chuckle among the officers. Brando's indifferent attitude won the hearts of most people. No one liked a coward, especially these young men with military qualities. "Then how can they help, Sir Commander?" As soon as Brando finished speaking, someone asked loudly. Most of the people present could not help but breathe a sigh of relief when they heard that Cruz's people would not intervene personally. After all, Brando was the only one present who came from another time and space. He was a freak who could completely ignore the deterrence of the Cruz Empire. After all, the Empire had accumulated power for centuries, and its strength had long been ingrained in people's hearts. "At least they can let our enemies advance on the battlefield. We have a large number of troops in front of us and a large army behind us. Everyone, please don't think that just because we defeated the White Lion Legion, we will have a smooth journey ahead. We've only defeated a small portion of the White Lion Legion's personal guard regiment. The real elites have yet to come." Brendel reminded the rest of the White Lion Legion. "The Door of Flame." Princess Griffin's silver eyes lit up slightly. "You mean the Holy Cathedral may build a temporary teleportation portal in Ampere Seal like the Door of Flame in the last Holy War?" Brando nodded. "But that kind of teleportation portal costs a lot of money, and it won't be a drop in the bucket for the Holy Cathedral. I heard that only a few teleportation portals like that were built in the entire war. Are they willing to invest so much for the nobles in the north?" Maynard asked. Brando couldn't help but shake his head. "Pure soldiers." Princess Griffin nodded calmly. "The Holy War is coming. A stable Erewhon is far more important to the Holy Cathedral than a teleportation portal. Besides, Erewhon is the front line of the war. It's necessary to have a temporary teleportation portal in the future. That means the Black Blade Squad and the White Lion Legion may appear on the battlefield in Ampere Seal at any time." Ruka nodded. "But our army is still in the territory of Vlada Pest." Enrique's expression changed a little. This guy who had fallen off his horse finally woke up. "This is going to be fun. Aren't we going to be surrounded like dumplings?" "Don't worry, all of this is just speculation. It's the Holy Cathedral's trump card. After all, the teleportation portal has a time limit. But we have to have a corresponding plan," Brando replied. "I like to plan ahead before doing something. I hope you guys are the same. So we need a new plan to deal with the changes that may happen next." "So what do you plan to do?" Maynard asked. "I haven't thought about it yet, but we can eliminate those unrealistic options one by one." Brando replied, "The most direct way is to turn around and kill our way back to the port area. In front of us are the patrolling cavalry and the main force of the Coast Guards, but we will also have the support of our allies. But now that the weather has cleared up, and although there are still storms in the open sea, since the Holy Cathedral knows that we may take the sea route, I'm afraid it's not a wise choice for us to make. Besides, in a battle on the sea, strong people with elemental strength and above can easily destroy our sailboats. By then, even if we don't get caught alive, I'm afraid we'll drown. that means we can only break through by land. Maynard replied calmly as if this matter had nothing to do with her. This female knight made Brando feel a little strange. She was completely different from the person he remembered. In Brando's memory, his senior was daring, confident, and calm. She always had an infectious smile on her face, but she never lacked dignity and decisiveness, as if she was a born leader. But there seemed to be something lingering around the female knight. Maynard finally frowned, her face cold. When she looked at someone, she seemed to be immersed in her own thoughts. She always seemed to be thinking about something. Every time Brando thought this, he felt a little strange. They were clearly two different people, but he always subconsciously compared them. Maynard saw that he was looking at her in a daze, and couldn't help but frown again. "I'm sorry." Brando came back to his senses. "It's nothing. But if we leave Amberlight by land, we need to pass through the Frata forest and cross the Erect mountains. This is not a smooth road. On the contrary, it's full of thorns. We may face Duke Erect's army, and at the same time, the nobles in the north won't let us break through so easily." "No, you're wrong. I'm afraid this is not a breakthrough but an escape. A dangerous and difficult escape with a small chance." Brando shook his head and smiled bitterly, "But we have no choice now. We have to break through from the south, leave Amberlight, pass through the Frata forest and the Erect mountains and join your army in the south." Her Highness and Lord Oberway's original plan was to break through from the south and leave Amberlight by land, right? With Lone Wolf's intelligence, I think he must have made arrangements in advance. As he spoke, he raised his head and looked at Princess Griffin. "Yes," the half-elf girl nodded calmly and answered on behalf of Oberway, "but we still don't have much choice. The army in my territory will go north along the Erect province, but it will take at least 3 to 4 days to reach the southern border of the Frata forest. And if they are stopped by the local army of the Erect province, I'm afraid it will take even longer." Brando listened and nodded secretly. He knew that the princess and Oberway had a trump card. Listening to her tone, this army was still useful. Even the army in the Erect province did not seem to be enough to completely defeat the enemy, and could only stop them for a while. As far as he knew, Her Highness' own army in the Frata Paz province definitely did not have this ability. The Knight Academy students also did not have this ability. In fact, at this time of the year, the only students who could be of use in the Royal Knight Academy were the first batch of graduates, plus the outstanding freshmen like Freya and Breton. In other words, Her Highness must have the support of the nobles behind her. The royal family's foundation was still very strong. This was only the nobles who supported the royal family. It did not take into account the king's party who had parted ways with them. The king's party was backed by Duke Anthony. If the two parties did not completely fall out with each other, they could really have the power to govern the north and south. But that was obviously not what Princess Griffin wanted. Brendel knew the princess better than anyone else. She was calm and rational on the surface, but in reality she was unyielding. She would never compromise with anyone. But it was obviously not just that. He showed a curious look. The princess definitely had more than this trump card. If that was the case, she would have been forced to forfeit at this card table. Right, what else did he not think of? Seeing Brando's eyes, Princess Griffin sighed. "But it's not like there's no chance, Mr. Brando. As long as we can leave the port of Amberlight and retreat towards St. White Bay, I can arrange for reliable allies to support us." St. White Bay? A light flashed in Brando's mind. He knew this place. This place was south of Amberlight, and after passing through the Frata forest, it was a bay surrounded by cliffs. Because of the geographical environment, it was not possible to build a port and wharf, so it was generally used as a temporary shelter. But in his memory he could only remember that it was the habitat of the storm hermit crab, a level 12 aquatic monster. In the past, this place was only related to a few fishermen in the port of Amberlight. Where would there be any allies? Wait. Anchor point. Brando suddenly reacted and could not help but blurt out, "The anchor point of Erewhon's first royal fleet." Princess Griffin let out a low cry. As soon as the words came out, Brando also realized something and looked up at Princess Griffin, only to see that Her Royal Highness was looking at him with an indescribable look. "Mr. Brando. How did you, I accidentally said the wrong thing again." He suddenly felt a little embarrassed. It was not a good thing to have advanced knowledge. It was too easy to be treated as a fraud. The secret anchor point of Erewhon's royal fleet in St. White Bay was a secret that no one outside the royal family knew. He was about to explain, but he did not expect the half-fairy princess to look at him with a complicated expression, as if she had understood something. After a while she said, Mr. Brando, so what Commander Buneyed said was true. Mr. the Shire is really still alive. You and Mr. Brando are really? Ah? Brando was stunned. Wait, what's the relationship between me and the Shire? Isn't it a relationship between a knight and a squire? Puzzled, he turned his head around. He saw the Shire's bitter smile. P.S. I forgot the time as I was writing. I saw that I had written 8K words. Ow. If you don't want to break up the plot recently, just post it all together. Also, let me explain. Recently, I wrote about the conflict Halo. If I remember correctly, it should be 7 points of defense now. There was a chapter where I wrote the wrong calculation formula and wrote 11 points. That should be a bug. I have changed it now. Everything will be based on the formula that Brando proposed when he met Abel. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 588. The merchant girl hugged her knees and squatted in the ruins. Occasionally, she would stretch out her slender neck to look at the situation outside. Her brown eyes darted around until she saw that there were no more soldiers outside. Then she patted the dust off her skirt and stood up. Ha! She let out a long sigh and asked, Sister White, this is the Holy Cathedral, but I don't think I saw Brando's face. The one called Big Sister White was a contract spirit in the form of a woman. Her upper body was that of a beautiful woman with a pair of elf-like pointy ears. However, her lower body seemed to be transparent, made up of swirling dust and air currents. This female figure was called a contract spirit in the ancient witchcraft literature recorded on red parchment. Although the Witch Queen could contract any contract spirit, she was especially fond of White Mist, the Queen of North Wind. White Mist was the keeper of knowledge on the glacier. The Queen of Ice left it to the Roman, hoping to borrow its wisdom and experience. White Mist was a beautiful woman, but she had a pair of lifeless eyes. She glanced at the Roman and answered weakly, Fate is in front of you and behind you. Mortals can grasp its direction, but they cannot see its form. I just felt that Brando should be there. Is the divination accurate, Sister White? The merchant girl could not help but ask curiously. Divination is to ask yourself. If you believe it, it will be there. If you don't, it won't be there. The Roman tilted her head. She did not know if she understood, but she walked confidently in a certain direction. After 2 steps, she stopped and took 2 steps back. Then she picked up a spiked hammer from the ruins. This was a holy weapon used by the clerics to exorcise evil spirits. The silver spiked hammer's handle was engraved with delicate patterns, and the head of the hammer was injected with a holy bullet. Usually the clerics would be careful with it. However, the merchant girl did not seem to have such a concept. She waved it around and nodded with satisfaction. You want to use this to protect yourself? Wisdom and knowledge are more effective. White Mist shook her head and disagreed. Yes, I used to have a hammer in Bucci. However, it was later lost by Brando. The Roman couldn't figure out which skeleton had picked up the hammer in the end. Anyway, he decided to frame Brando first. It was impossible for a merchant like him to be careless. It was all Brando's fault. Brando sneezed for no reason. The two of them passed through the ruins of the Anderla Cathedral. Just as they were about to reach a certain spot, there was a sudden crashing sound. The rubble loosened and rolled down from the slanted wall. Then a person came out from below. The man was wearing a noble's formal attire and had a long sword at his waist. However, his hair and clothes were covered in white lime powder, making him look dusty. Benninger blinked his eyes. It took him a while to get used to the sunlight outside. When he left through the secret passage, he did not expect the ground to crack open and lava to gush out in all directions. His followers were buried in the sea of fire. He relied on his family's talisman to survive. Then he used his memory of the secret passage under the cathedral to find a way to escape. He pushed open the stone wall and saw a beautiful person standing not too far away from him. She had her hands behind her back and was staring at him with her mouth agape. Benninger was meticulous and had an amazing memory. Even though he had only seen the Roman once when she was with Magadal, he recognized her immediately. Miss Roman? Ah, the Roman was slightly stunned. How do you recognize me? It's me, Benninger. Miss Roman, do you still remember me? I'm with the princess. We've met before. Benninger was secretly happy to see that the girl was so gullible. He did not know what happened outside the cathedral, but he guessed that the two sides were at war. The girl in front of him was obviously very close to Brando. If he could get his hands on her, the princess would have one less ally. Oh, the Roman nodded seriously. I know. Since you recognized me, there's nothing I can do about it. Benninger was slightly stunned. What's with this conversation? Wait, I'm the princess? Never in his wildest dreams would he have thought that Romaine would make a move just like that. What was even more unexpected was that Romaine had hidden her trump card behind her back. By the time he reacted, Romaine had already raised her mace and swung it at his head. Viscount Benninger himself was at the pinnacle of iron ranked. Normally, being hit by a hammer from an ordinary person would only cause him a little pain. However, he did not expect the mace that Miss Merchant had picked up was also a ceremonial item. When the mace hit his head, there was a burst of golden light. Our poor Benninger let out a scream and fainted. You're obviously a man, but you still want to pretend to be a princess. Don't be like that, the Roman snorted and mocked him, imitating Brando's idiom. White Mist looked at her speechlessly. But this guy seems to be quite strong. I don't think that hit was enough to kill him. He'll wake up soon. You'd better find something to tie him up. However, the contract spirit was not a kind-hearted person. Her duty was only to ensure the safety of her contractor, not to teach her who was right and who was wrong. The Roman agreed and quickly took out a white silk rope from her bag and tied Benninger up. Still not satisfied, she took out a purple silk rope and did the same. White Mist sighed. These two ropes had a great history. One was given to her by the Queen of Ice, Olemus's silk, which could connect the mortal realm to the kingdom of the dead. If a mortal walked along this rope, they would be able to enter the kingdom of the dead. The other was the Witch Queen's inheritance, Tyvo's hair. Tyvo was the king of the Titans and Wand. Legend had it that he was extremely strong, and even his hair had the ability to pull anything up. This hair also had the ability to increase one's strength. However, the Roman actually used it to tie someone up. It was a waste. However, it was definitely sturdy. Just as White Mist said, Benninger only fainted for a short while before waking up. His peak iron rank strength was much stronger than normal people. However, he immediately realized that he was tied up. He did not know what the rope was made of, but it looked no different from a normal silk rope. He struggled for a while, but it did not budge at all. What is the meaning of this, Miss Roman? Benninger raised his head and asked in exasperation. His fair face and forehead were red, and there were even a few drops of blood oozing out. He looked like a plum blossom petal in the snow. It was a pitiful sight. A captive. The Roman answered matter-of-factly. But I am on the princess's side, Miss Roman. I am Mr. Brando's friend. Her Highness and Mr. Brando are being framed by the Holy Cathedral of Fire and the nobles in the north. They are in danger, we have to hurry and help them. Benninger could not help but shout at the top of his lungs. His face was filled with sincerity. He was born with a face that women adored, and in a moment of desperation he really looked like one. The Roman raised her eyebrows and asked seriously, You said that Brando is in danger. Who are you? I am Benninger, Viscount Roman. Don't you remember me, Miss Roman? Benninger sighed. He was so angry that he was about to go crazy. Unfortunately, he was on the chopping block and could only endure. Oh, I remember now. You are that Viscount Benninger. The merchant girl looked as if she had just realized something. At the same time, she raised her mace and hit him on the head. The grenade of holy light had already been used, so Benninger did not faint this time. However, the pain made him cry uncontrollably. What the hell is going on now? What did I say wrong again? His head was buzzing, and at the same time, he felt like he could hear 10,000 people talking in his ears. This guy is up to no good. He is lying to you. But how did you find out? Oh, I didn't find out, the Roman answered matter-of-factly. I hate that Viscount Benninger the most. He is even more handsome than Brando. He must be a bad guy. Viscount Benninger's heart was bleeding. What kind of logic was this? For the first time, he felt that his intelligence was completely useless, because the other party was completely unreasonable. Although White Mist was speechless, with her wisdom, she would not be so shallow. She nodded. Your intuition is very sharp. This may be the reason why she chose you to inherit this legacy. A witch needs to see through the fog and see through the threads of fate. The eyes of the soul are far better than the eyes of the mortal world. Then how should we deal with him? The merchant girl was a little smug. He wants to lie to you. He must be up to something. You can ask him what his original plan was. People can lie, but they can't hide their desires. White Mist answered. Viscount Benninger's face turned pale. The other party did not try to hide their conversation from him. He could tell that although the merchant girl in front of him looked gullible, the person beside her was a person with great wisdom. People like him, who prided themselves on their intelligence, preferred to solve problems with their brains instead of violence. Benninger had always looked down on those barbaric soldiers, but when he was in a difficult situation, he could not help but tremble in fear. Why did you lie to me? The Roman squatted down beside him and tilted her head to look at the Viscount. I didn't lie to you, Miss Roman. Everything I said is true. Viscount Benninger clenched his teeth. Although he knew that he would not succeed, he still needed a little bit of luck. Tell me the truth. Everything I said is. As soon as Benninger opened his mouth, he realized that something was wrong. It was as if his mouth was not listening to him, and he stuttered out his intentions. He looked at the Roman in horror. If he had known that she was a witch, he would have turned around and left the moment he saw her. Unfortunately, it was too late for regrets. You really are a bad guy. The Roman heard that Benninger was trying to trick her to blackmail Brando. She could not help but hit Benninger with her mace. Benninger hugged his head and screamed in pain, tears and snot running down his face. You said that Brando is the Count. What is that all about? Benninger was tortured to the point where he did not look like a human anymore, but he was still very honest. He quickly replied with tears and snot running down his face. Miss Roman, Marquis Joachim told us that Mr. Brando might be the real Count Yenbao. Everyone thought that he was a Highland knight or just a bandit from Tanajul. However, according to the information I received, both are unlikely. Mr. Brando first appeared in our sights after the incident at Fortress Reeden. He was not a Highland knight, but his actions were that of a noble. This cannot be faked, and as far as I know, there is no such person in the noble circle. So we thought that he might be a descendant of an unknown noble in the kingdom or an alias. Now, it seems that Marquis Joachim's judgment may be correct. I see. Sister White, what do you think? This person wants to harm that person and you want to help that person. Conspiracies are like chains. Why don't you ask him what he is most afraid of? White Mist looked at the Viscount, who was lying limp on the ground, expressionless. Benninger's face was suddenly filled with fear, horror, and unwillingness. Oh? Satisfy the Romans' curiosity? P.S. Today is 3,000 words. Take a break and prepare for the end of the month. Tomorrow is the great adventure of the little Roman and White Mist. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 589. The Green Rider galloped along the slope, and Bunide's hands, which were covered with scaled gloves, gripped the reins tightly as he turned his head back. In the direction north of Ampere Seal, a few huge light portals were opening on the horizon, and countless troops were pouring out from them, densely packed like a swarm of ants. In another half an hour, the Black Blade Squad will appear on the battlefield of Ampere Seal. Cruz's men will also be involved. My lord, what do you think we should do? The Highland Knight commander looked solemnly at the small black dots rising from the horizon. Those were the Black Blade Squad's Flying Dragon Squad. In an instant, they covered the sky and rushed towards Ampere Seal. This number was far more than the Black Blade Squad. It seemed that the Holy Cathedral had completely deviated from the neutral position. The nobles in the north and the Holy Cathedral's hidden forces in Erewhon had all sided with Duke Cypher. Cruz's men wanted to solve the problem once and for all. He turned his head and looked at his men. What do you all think? The Highland Knight has been waiting for this day for a long time, my lord. Everything is like the prophecy, my lord. We believe in your judgment. The kingdom has tried to forget the war, but the veterans have never forgotten it. Because this is a promise. Because this is a promise. The copper dragon Redo looked at the dark sea outside Tanajul and said quietly to Coden beside him. The situation in the north was getting more and more tense day by day. Perhaps today or perhaps yesterday, the young lord must have started his plan in Ampere Seal. He turned his head. In the Highlands, the knights will never forget their promises. So you knew it from the beginning? Coden asked. That swordsmanship is unique, Redo replied. Besides, the veterans have their own pride. How can they listen to a child even if the other party is a noble? Besides, didn't you recognize it from the beginning? The war that lasted for half a century, Coden replied, has brought disaster to Erewhon that continues to this day. Ever since the Second Renaissance, the nobles have completely fallen, but that's only the surface. In the end, there is still no hope. Even someone like Leiter was afraid. Redo sighed. His prestige that day was second only to the Marshal. However, I don't agree with him. Merely wanting to protect Erewhon is betraying the foundation of this kingdom. Why does Erewhon exist? Because I yearn for glory. So, what is the answer to that riddle? Coden asked. No one knows. Redo shook his head. Those who know are no longer in this world. Perhaps Lord Tulman knows something, but he has left the kingdom because of it. Actually, I have a guess. Reto turned around and looked at his former comrade curiously. Before the trial, the marshal asked me a question. Koden took a deep breath. What is the truth of history? From a certain point in time, you became a true Highland Knight. My lord, you should understand this. No. Brando shook his head. I still don't understand. Even if I have some relationship with the Highland Knight, as far as I know, the inheritance of the Highland Knight is not like this. Yes. The Shire smiled mysteriously. My lord, why don't you think about it carefully? Why did you summon me? And what is the inheritance of the Highland Knight? This was not a problem for Brando. The teachings of the Highland Knight were engraved on the ancient stone slabs of the Karsuk Highlands, praised by generations. Many travelers and poets recited these teachings and sang them everywhere. And as a player he remembered even more clearly. The Highland Knight was passed down from generation to generation, and the blood connection could not be broken. From the moment his descendant took over the sword of his ancestor, he had embarked on this path. But before he could finish this sentence he suddenly froze. His face turned pale. The sword in his hand also fell to the ground with a clang. The Shire smiled but did not say anything. Moreover, my swordsmanship is not bad. I'm not bragging. That old sergeant personally praised me and said that my swordsmanship was the best in this batch of students. My bedroom door is not far from me. Thank you, Lady Martha. I only need to rush out a few more steps to see my sword lying there quietly. That sword is also one of my family heirlooms. My grandfather once used it in battle. It is said that he was an attendant for a knight for a period of time, and this sword was bestowed to him by that knight. That sword should be the 32nd standard. There is an ivy imprint on the sword to commemorate the victory of the Battle of Grinwar's Highlands. I remember that year, His Majesty changed the standard of the cavalry's longsword. The length of the sword was changed from the original 2-arm length to 1.5-arm length, and the copper ornaments on the guard were also changed to ordinary iron flowers. This was to save costs and adapt to the November War that was getting longer and longer. Brando could not hear anything clearly. He only felt that his head was exploding. It was as if something had exploded. He closed his eyes and felt that he was a complete idiot. What 32nd standard sword? What commemoration of the victory of the Battle of Grinwar's Highlands? He was really an idiot. Wasn't it the Highland Knight who participated in the Battle of Grinwar's Highlands? He should have remembered all of this, but because he deliberately ignored it and was misled by Brando's memories, he actually forgot the most important point. Brendel was stunned for a long while before he finally regained his senses. Fortunately, there was another half of his soul in his body, so he was not unable to accept this fact. In fact, it was the opposite. He quickly calmed down. After secretly cursing Brando for being an idiot, he looked at the whole thing from Sophie's point of view. Then everything became simple and clear. He raised his head and looked at the Shire, Oberway, Maynard, and Her Royal Highness. It seemed that only these 4 people knew the truth. However, as to why it was these 4 people, this was a little interesting. Brando slightly organized his thoughts and then asked, "So, it seems that my grandfather is not just an unknown veteran like he said?" Brando was not stupid enough to think that Her Royal Highness would know every veteran of the November War. Moreover, looking at her and Oberway's reaction, it was very likely that his grandfather had a big background. Connecting the words of the Highland Knights commander, Bun-Eyed, the Shire's identity was also very suspicious. Brando was suddenly annoyed. It seemed that the whole thing was hidden from him. Although this child was indeed cute and stupid in the past 20 years, but no matter what, the plot still made him feel that it was a bit melodramatic. So now he needed an answer. "You don't know?" Princess Griffin was slightly stunned, but she immediately reacted. Marshall really did follow the agreement and did not reveal a single word to outsiders. She looked at the Shire and asked, "Mr. the Shire?" The Shire could not help but smile bitterly. "Actually, this is a misunderstanding. But in fact, since the day I came back to this world, I understood that the twin goddesses, Alice, really used the thread to weave the fate of this world. Like I said, everything is preordained by the heavens." Marshall? Brando seemed to have heard an inexplicable word. As far as he knew, Erwin never had such a military rank, position, title. What is going on? "My lord, in fact, as you have guessed, your grandfather was never an unknown person." The Shire sighed and replied. Brando was silent. He had expected this. His grandfather's swordsmanship was extraordinary, How could it be that it was not something that a veteran could have? Reto was also a veteran of the November War, but compared to his grandfather, it was like the difference between heaven and earth. The funny thing was that Brando had thought that his grandfather's swordsmanship was only slightly better than others. He did not know whether to laugh or cry. The funniest thing was that Brando did not know his grandfather's name. When the old man was still alive, the people around him called him Old Tobuz. But it was obviously an alias. Brando did not remember a famous name that overlapped with this name. The Shire continued, in fact, all of this started from the Highland Knight. Just as you have guessed, my lord, your grandfather was a genuine Highland Knight when he was young, and the blood of the Highland Knight also flows in your body. And at that time he had a mage servant called the Shire Pilus. Ah! The surrounding youths seemed to have heard a bizarre story, and they all looked at the young mage in shock. Although Brando had expected it, he could not help but take a breath. The Shire Pilus. The Shire Pilus, the Shire, you are a mage from the Pilus family? The Shire nodded. Pilus is the most prominent title among the wizards of the tower. Their bloodline is also the closest to the Silver Folk. To have you as a servant, you're not trying to tell me that my grandfather's surname should be Cardeloso, are you? Princess Griffin interrupted. The Shire is not lying. Brando, your grandfather is a descendant of the most prominent family of the Highland Knight. His real name should be Darius Cardeloso, which is often called Earth Sword Saint Darius. At that moment, Brando felt like he was listening to a legend, but this time he was experiencing it in person. In that distant memory, when the kingdom was at the peak of its second recovery, Erwin had 3 strong men who had reached the ultimate realm: Earth Sword Saint Darius, Gareth Keys of the Kingdom of Heaven, and Tulman the Scholar of the Mithril Fortress. But Brando would never have dreamed that the most famous of the 3 was actually his own grandfather. He looked at the princess and the Shire in a daze. The Shire could not help but smile bitterly again. My lord, your grandfather actually had another name. He was honored because of this name, but also because of this name he was the Dragon of Harash, the Marshal of the Holy Cathedral of Fire in the last Holy War. So, Coden finally asked, you wrote a letter to Bunide? What did you tell him in the letter? Reto nodded and looked in the direction of the sea. After a while, he replied, I only asked him if he still remembers the Dragon of Harash. Ah, Coden suddenly laughed. Of course he remembers. How could he forget? P.S. A small change. Previously, I accidentally wrote, the First Holy War, instead of the Last Holy War. Odal, I'm guilty. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 590. The streets were silent, and Brando seemed to be immersed in the memories of a long time ago. Sword Saint Darius, this name was both strange and familiar to him. Since the second revival, this name once belonged to one of the 3 important ministers who supported the kingdom of Erwin. He was active a century before Erwin, and in the Amber Sword, that era was just a background for the players. In history later on, the kingdom's spirit was no longer strong. It was said that Gory Keys ran away, and Tulman returned to the Mithril Fortress. The Sword Saint also lived in seclusion since then. Some people said that he was still alive and some said that he was already dead. But in Brando's own memory, he still remembered the moment when his grandfather held his hand. It was just an old man who looked withered. Although his eyes still burned with a flame of determination that was far beyond that of ordinary people, he had reached the end of his life. And in another memory of him, Sophie and Brando, in the dream of the golden tree, the old soldier from the November War held a long sword and nodded with a smile. That was a world made up of Brando's memories, and nothing in that world would be different. He could even clearly feel that kind of expectation, but it was not until today that he understood that the old man had placed some kind of expectation on Brando. However, in the real history, Brando himself may have died in the old house in Bucci. If that was the case, why didn't he tell Brando the secret of the Ring of the Wind Empress? What was the Sword Saint hiding in the end? My grandfather was the Grand Marshal of the Holy Cathedral of Fire in the last Holy War? After a while, Brando suddenly raised his head and asked, Ah, I thought my lord would be more surprised by the old man's identity as the Sword Saint. The Shire was slightly startled. Indeed, the old man served as the Grand Marshal of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. No. In Brando's memory, in the history of the other world, Sword Sage Darius had never served as the Grand Marshal of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Either history was lying or the Shire was lying. Brando looked at the Shire and the princess. Princess Griffin also looked at him, but there was a sense of recognition in her silver eyes. Sword Saint Darius was also a member of the royal faction. He wasn't even a member of the new royal faction. But why did he leave the center of power, the declining house of Corvado? The look in the eyes of the Shire and the princess told him that they were not lying. Or perhaps they were so good at lying that they could tell what they were thinking. The princess was only 16 years old this year. But history has never recorded this. Brando pretended to be skeptical. Because throughout history, the Holy Cathedral of Fire has always kept the records of every holy war a secret. What? Brando mercilessly exposed the Shire's lie. No matter how confidential the records of the previous holy wars were, some words would still be leaked. Not to mention the prominent position of the Grand Marshal of the Holy War, it was impossible for the entire upper nobility of Erewhon to forget. What's more, in another history, in order to investigate the death of the princess, Brando had the honor of reading the secret records of the Holy Cathedral. Regarding the history of the November War, Sword Saint Darius did not appear at all. Unless there was a change in history or all the information related to Sword Saint Darius had been deleted or sealed. There was something else. The part of Brando's soul that belonged to the game suddenly awakened. The memories in his mind seemed to come alive in an instant, like a flowing river of language and words, emerging from the depths of his thoughts one by one. The year Sword Saint Darius lived in seclusion, the 325th year of the First Era, the year of Castor. A number broke into his thoughts like a bolt of lightning. At that time, in the year of stars, on the 17th of the lunar month, Count Adania led the White Lion Infantry Regiment to the west into the Hagen area, supporting the Cruz people on the flank and attacking the Black Fong tribe of the Toquinen Lionmen. Since then, the Holy Cathedral of Earth had been defeated, and then the four holy cathedrals had reached a reconciliation agreement in 4 years. 4 years after the Year of Stars, the Holy War ended. Brando clearly remembered that the Year of Stars was the 321st year of the First Era. The two time nodes coincided. This was interesting. There was indeed a problem. He could not help but close his eyes, and the flashing river of time appeared one by one in front of him. The Battle of the Long River. The Bleeding Quintins. The Holy Cathedral of Fire went east. The attack on the Alfalfa Fields. Then it was the beginning of the long and bitter November War. The Holy War had never been so bloody. Brando suddenly realized what made the war so cruel. The veterans who had experienced more than a decade of war were quickly depleted in less than a year of war. Around a series of tug-of-war battles in the Alcash Mountains. Historical records said that the four holy cathedrals entered this area at the same time, and then there was a long and dark war, a war that lasted for a year. Almost all the blood of the small duchies and kingdoms like Erewhon that were vassals of the four holy cathedrals had been drained. The shadow of that war had lasted until now, and Erewhon had lost an entire generation or even 2 generations of young people. Brando suddenly felt a chill. History was so close. In another war 100 years later, the Night Nation Grecius, Fanzan, Eloranta, the Holy Cathedral of the Wind Empress, and Madara once again entered this area. It was also a tragic war. He still remembered the overwhelming army of the undead. Everything seemed to be in darkness. But the Alcash Mountain Pass did not seem to have such an important strategic position. Why did the holy cathedrals fight here again and again? The Alcash Mountain Pass was the traditional territory of Fanzan, but until later the Cruz people, the Wind Elves and the undead army of Madara were all stationed here. Brando's heart pounded, and he realized that he might have grasped the center of gravity. He clearly remembered that after the November War, the Holy War was basically declared over. His grandfather was also living in seclusion at this time. It was as if there was a special player's keenness that told him that if there was a problem in this plot, it must be in the November War. That tragic war that existed in the memories of all the veterans. Brando also remembered a detail. In that war, the Holy Cathedral awarded many veterans with the precious Candlelight Medal for outstanding performance. This was unprecedented. He opened his eyes, which flashed with a breathtaking light. "Are you okay, Mr. Brando?" Princess Griffin asked. "Why didn't you tell me until now?" Brando shook his head and asked. "I'm sorry," the Shire sighed. "If I could not say it, I would rather keep this secret. To be able to silently protect the Lord, who is the descendant of Marshal Darius, this is already the best wish." Brando glanced at him as if he wanted to see through this guy. But the Shire was still the Shire, a young man wearing the robe of an archmage and with a confident smile on his face. The Shire also responded with a smile. "This cunning guy," Brando thought in his heart. "Let's change the question. Why did my grandfather live in seclusion in Brags in the end? You know, I didn't even know that he was a Highland knight. Was my father also kept in the dark?" No, your father should know some inside information, Brando, Princess Griffin replied. In fact, I don't know much, but at least I know that when Lord Darius left the army, your father was already an adult. On that day he also arranged a marriage. According to the tradition of the Highland Knight, the other party was also a noble of Catarago. That was my mother, but my grandfather never taught me about the traditions of the nobles. Before I grew up to a certain age, I never thought that and did not know that the people of Catarago had anything to do with the Highland Knight, Brando replied. Ah, Lord Darius is like this. Then did he teach you swordsmanship? Princess Griffin was slightly surprised. Grandfather taught me some swordsmanship, but it was all superficial military swordsmanship, Brando replied. Ah. The half-fairy princess was really surprised this time. She couldn't help but raise her long eyelashes and looked at Brando curiously. Mr. Brando, your swordsmanship? There's more to it than meets the eye, Brando replied, including the knowledge that I have now. In my other experience, I once studied under a wizard. Brando thought that he wasn't lying. His swordsmanship did have another origin. It was an improved military swordsmanship that was modified by a player from the sword St. Darius. He was also once taught by a wizard, but that was in the game. That must be a tortuous experience, Griffin said with some admiration. Yes, so tortuous. Brando sighed, but the meaning was very different from what Griffin had imagined. At least he had never heard of, let alone experienced, such a story. Ever since he escaped from Bucci, the two worlds had overlapped in his life. So, what's going on here? Brendel sighed and continued to ask. He pretended to be eager to know the answer, but the answer was already in his heart. He just needed to confirm it. I think there must be more to this than meets the eye. My lord, I said I will keep the secret. The Shire replied, in fact, the past is meaningless. We only need to know that fate still favors some people. My lord, your appearance here today proves that the old master was right. No, he was probably the only one who understood that all of this was not connected by fate, because history had already changed. He was the only one who knew the true future, and his presence here proved that everything that had been fixed had already become unstable. Because Brando was supposed to die in Bucci, and Erwin was supposed to step on the path predetermined by history. However, fate handed the present world to Alice, but handed history and the future to the blind goddess Elaine. The present world was connected by an invisible line, and this line was cause and effect. History and the future presented infinite unknowns and possibilities on the cards. It was because of this infinite future. Only mortals could control their own fate. Brando firmly believed in this, so where did the problem lie? There must be such a line that Brando did not die and he did not cross. In which world, what kind of scene would it be? What was the mission entrusted to Brando? What a loser. Brando couldn't help but curse. The descendant of a sword saint died in the hands of a skeleton. This was probably the biggest joke in the history of Erwin, but it was completely buried in the game, leaving no trace. But it didn't matter, he had at least guessed part of the answer. Brando glanced at the Shire and asked, if I'm not wrong, in November of the Year of the Stars, the Holy Cathedral of Fire's coalition forces, the Erwin Kingdom army must have been attacked from behind by their allies in the Alcash Mountains, right? Let me guess, but what the Holy Cathedral of Fire didn't expect was that Sword St. Darius was so strong that he led Erwin's army to kill a bloody path. Is that right? His voice wasn't loud, but it was sonorous and powerful. Every word he spoke was filled with vitality. Brando looked calm and composed, but Her Royal Highness bit her lip, and the Shire looked like he had seen a ghost. Everyone was stunned by this outrageous statement. Only then did Brando suddenly laugh, but the light in his eyes at that moment was so wise and confident in the eyes of others. Ha! Brando almost wanted to laugh out loud. So that's how it is, so that's how Madara's undead army attacked us from behind back then? Those bastards from the Fire of the Thorns, haha, I really wronged you back then. The Holy Cathedral of Fire, the Holy Cathedral of Light, how interesting. It's a pity, I'm actually a player and a transmigrated player at that. This was really a surprise. Brando gritted his teeth and laughed. P.S. It will start the day after tomorrow, please reserve your votes. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chitian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 591. The leaves of the forest were bright and vibrant, and there was a thin layer of mist under the branches. The Frata forest was as tranquil as a painting. However, someone finally broke the silence. The knight used his sword to push aside a bunch of leaves and led his horse out from behind the bushes. He then saw a group of people sitting in the forest not far away. Makarov looked up and saw the people behind the knight. His gloomy face relaxed. He patted the leaves off his shoulders and stood up. "You're finally here." The young man sat on his horse and looked at them with a tense face. He didn't answer. Makarov immediately realized that something was wrong. Within his field of vision, many knights in black and red robes rushed out from the forest and surrounded the royal faction. Dozens of longbows with their bowstrings pulled taut were aimed at everyone around the bonfire with sharp arrows flashing with cold light. It was Duke Anthony's army. This was definitely not a joke. "What is the meaning of this, Eek?" Makarov asked loudly. "I'm sorry, Mr. Makarov," Eek looked at them and said proudly, "you know that as long as I'm a knight, even if it's only for a second, I will never go back on my words." Makarov immediately understood what Eek wanted. He couldn't believe that Eek would go crazy at this time. "You're being silly. You know what's right. We should go rescue Prince Haruz and escort him to the Duke's territory. This is our last chance." "No," Eek interrupted him. "I know what's right. Justice and ideals. Just like you told me, the beliefs of the royal faction. But we have to ask ourselves, are we still on the side of glory? Could it be that too many losses have made us lose the spirit of a reformer? The royal faction once promised to keep their promises, but what about after that? Don't tell me all we need is a victory?" The young man looked up and looked at the direction of Amberlight's port. Under the blue sky it looked like a holy city. It was sparkling and emitting light, making it impossible for people to look at it directly. "No, what we need is to pick up the spirit that the people of Erewhon have completely abandoned. This is the common goal of the king faction, the princess and all the people of Erewhon." He turned around and looked at the others who were dumbfounded. "The battle is far from over. Is the royal faction leaving the battlefield?" "You're crazy, Echo." Makarov couldn't believe that his student would say something like that. He immediately signaled Buga to restrain this crazy young man. However, Eek seemed to be exceptionally clear-headed today. He immediately turned to Buga and said, "Teacher Buga, as the new Count of Carolyn, the only successor of Duke Anthony, and the commander of this army, I order you to stand on my side. Only because I would not order you to raise your sword against your companions, and the princess is still in the city. I only want the soldiers of Lantan Island to live up to their oath. I have a share of the glory now, but I will not enjoy it alone. The order and glory are both here, Master Buga, please don't disappoint me," the young man said sincerely. Buga and Makarov couldn't help but look at each other with a bitter smile. They had been preparing for this moment for a long time, but they didn't expect this result. Echo is an idiot with a knight's mindset. "I know you're here, Yura." The cunning fox shook his head and shouted into the forest. The sound of hooves could be heard and the blind girl came out from behind Echo. Her face was gentle and quiet. Even though she couldn't see, her heart seemed to be able to see everything. "Yura, you can tell right from wrong." "Yes, because I only ask my heart." Yura smiled. "The 9 phoenixes have spoken, and a gentleman's vow is worth 1,000 gold. Makarov and Fleetwood couldn't help but sigh. They couldn't help but look up at the sky above the branches. The blue sky seemed to reflect everything that had happened in the past. Since when did the royal faction have the determination to advance? Makarov still remembered the most difficult time he had gone through. He even had to hide his identity and become a mercenary leader in a remote area. Perhaps the royal faction had experienced too many failures and too much waiting, to the point that they couldn't afford another failure. Erewhon's future was far away from people like them. Duke Anthony's army finally entered the battlefield, flying a flag that no one could imagine. But no one would guess the answer to this riddle. In the port of Amberlight, the students of the Royal Knight Academy were passing through the entire southern part of the city, but they didn't meet the enemy that they expected. Their enemy, the Coast Guards of Amberlight, was experiencing their worst defeat in decades. Sani and his men were patrolling the ruined position of the Coast Guards. In Sani's yellow, cold, narrow eyes, the Coast Guards under Marquis Urian had finally collapsed. The defeated soldiers walked out from behind the position with their weapons raised high. There were so many of them that it was a little shocking. In just 4 hours. Although the Coast Guards of Amberlight claimed to have 35,000 men, Sani estimated that they had defeated less than half of them in a frontal battle. In a rich area like Amberlight, the existence of the Coast Guards was similar to that of a mercenary. Most of the nobles were aware of this. But the question was, who would dare to attack the territory of the Holy Cathedral? Sani used his Grey Fin Naga guards to give the Merchant Council a resounding answer. More than 15,000 soldiers were completely defeated in less than half a day on the battlefield that was less than 5 kilometers wide. They didn't even escape but were captured. This was a joke. Marquis Urian was stunned. Perhaps he had expected this. The only thing he didn't understand was what the Nagas were up to. Sani saw his adjutant, who had darker scales, reporting to him and asking if they should continue moving forward. He raised his head, and his yellow eyes reflected the inner city of Ampere Seal. This was Erewin's strongest fortress in the south. But how far were they going to support that human? He glanced at the Neptune's trident in his hand. The gemstone on the trident was flickering as if it was a gamble. Then he nodded. Continue to advance. Meet up with Brando. The situation on the battlefield was slowly tilting. Cruz's men entered the battlefield. The Black Blade squad was completing their final assembly. The Dragon Knight covered the sky above Ampere Seal's port. In the distant horizon, a group of winged monsters seemed to form a curved sky. The whole sky was filled with screams and noises. It was like the end of the world. What Danos saw from his mount was a wall of wyverns charging at him from the front. It wasn't just the Dragon Knight of the Black Blade squad. He saw all kinds of emblems on the shields. Almost all the Dragon Knights in the north were gathered here. One man against thousands of soldiers. Danos was at a loss. He seemed to have seen the same scene on another battlefield. Endless undead and only despair was left. He even thought that they were the only ones left in Erewin who were still resisting. But today he felt full of anger. This kingdom had such a powerful army. But why was this army still his enemy? Where were they when facing Madara? They were killing each other. Could this kingdom still be saved? Danos felt the despair that hit him in the face. He closed his eyes. In the darkness it was a rainy night. A beam of fire went straight to the sky. The south gate was right in front of him. So Brando stopped the discussion about his background. He knew better than anyone that an army of an unimaginable size was crossing the Strait of Ampere Seal. It even crossed thousands of miles and appeared on the battlefield. The army gathered around Ampere Seal in an instant, and it became a dangerous place. Whether it was his own speculation or the information he got from Danos, he could come to this conclusion. However, the Flying Dragon Brigade of the Southern Legion was retreating. Brando had already ordered them to retreat in the direction of St. White Bay. This was the last retreat. Whether they succeeded or failed, it all depended on this last fight. And they did not have much time left. He had already led the students of the Royal Knight Academy through the entire south city of Ampere Seal. From Old Fisherman Street to Villican Square, there was no trace of the enemy. Although Brando had doubts in his heart, he did not dare to delay. The huge fortress at the south gate of Ampere Seal's port seemed to appear in his vision in an instant. But it was like a dead fortress. Where were the coast guards? Brando and everyone could not help but look up. Then they saw a familiar figure appear in their vision. The long street at that moment was like a holy white, under the golden sun. And the person on the fortress smiled slightly, then raised his hand high. Amidst the rumbling, the huge south gate of Ampere Seal's port slowly opened. Everyone could not help but open their mouths wide. Count Audine stood upright at the top of the city wall. He held a long sword in his hand and looked at the army that was gradually appearing from the long street. To be exact, he was looking at the young leader at the front of the army. It was like seeing the fire that ignited people's hearts in that long night. He believed that there would be a moment like this, where this miracle would happen again to Erewin. But it was not until he saw Princess Griffine behind Brando that he understood that Martha had never been far away from her people. Brando also smiled. It was as if he had once again returned to that exciting history, surrounded by like-minded comrades. Erewin's people had never given up, and they were the same. Even if they were facing thousands of soldiers and horses, so what? In the loop of trade winds, I heard that you would save this kingdom, Count Audine shouted from the top of the city wall, but I didn't believe it. So you're here? Yes, Count Audine laughed, so I'm here. I want to witness it for Her Royal Highness. All of this. Behind Brando, the half-elf girl bit her lower lip, but there were tears in her silver eyes. Although the kingdom has decayed, new sprouts have been born within. Just like life, the cycle repeats. The cycle never ends. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 592. Outside the south gate of the port of Ampere Seal, a gentle slope extended along the foothills of the Marchenko mountain, and the black mixed forest came into Brando's sight. The young people of the Royal Knight Academy couldn't help but cheer in unison. Although the crisis was far from over, being one step closer to freedom still made everyone feel refreshed. We're finally out. Brando breathed a sigh of relief in his heart. After all, hiding in the forest was much easier than fighting in the streets. Especially in Erewhon, the port of Amberlight was one of the most heavily infiltrated areas of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Fighting in someone else's home ground always gave people a sense of oppression. The addition of Count Audine gave him a big surprise. After asking, he found out that the other party had already met with Oberway and made a plan. At that time, if the princess and her party had chosen to go north, then he would have led the troops to the port north of Vladapace to meet them. But if they had chosen to go south like now, the troops that had been lurking here earlier would have become a clever hidden chess piece. Audine also brought a druid master named Wuxia. Brando recognized this person. This great druid was a herbalist who lived in seclusion in the Marchenko mountain near Amberlight. He specialized in teaching players master-level herbalism recipes. However, Brando was not interested in herbalism. He was interested in the information itself. This great druid was not a good friend of Audine, but was invited by Master Anderson of the Loop of Trade Winds through a letter. Druids were neutral in the Amber Sword, and rarely intervened in foreign affairs, just like how the Great Elder only agreed to participate in the defense of Valhalla. Now that Anderson took the initiative to write a letter to intervene in Erewhon's internal strife, it was unknown whether it was his own idea or the Great Elder's idea. However, the latter was very likely. This meant that the Loop of the World might have known of his existence and recognized his actions to a certain extent. This was a huge piece of good news. Brando was different from the average person. Most people thought that the druids were scattered and gathered in the forest on the border, communicating with each other through the trade winds. They were both marginal and powerful, as long as you didn't provoke them. However, Brando was clear about the existence of the Loop of the World and the Druid Circle Council. With their approval, many things would be much more convenient in the future. However, the future was the future and there were still huge difficulties to be solved now. After a few words of greeting, Brando didn't dare to delay any longer and immediately ordered the young people of the Royal Knight Academy to disperse into the Frata forest. He looked at the southern armies' army. The dragon cavalries of the Black Blade Squad had apparently discovered their presence. Ants, and the Black Blade Squad. Ants. But the archers. And Archers SS was. The best way to deal with flying units in the Amber Sword was to wait until the opponent entered the diving phase before attacking. Otherwise, it would just be a waste of energy. Tell them to stop attacking. Brando immediately shouted to Count Audine, bring them into the forest. Count Audine also understood that his soldiers lacked experience. He was afraid that they would fall apart if the dragon cavalry charged at them. He nodded and immediately urged his private soldiers to move closer to the Frata forest. Carlo, Breton, and Moke were leading the team. Noticing the situation behind them, the leader of the Erewhon trio pulled the reins and stopped. He turned back and shouted, Mr. Brando, the Royal Knight Academy also has archery training. Ask Count Audine to give us the bows and arrows. We can stay and cover the retreat. There's no need for that. Protect the princess well. Brendel replied. He looked up at the flies above his head. Without any hesitation, he directed the wind spirit spiders that were hiding in the air to aim in that direction. Previously, when he activated the Holy Sword to kill Baron Rodu's knights in the battle at the port of Amberlight, he had only used the energy in 20 to 30 Holy Swords. He did not use most of the Holy Sword technique during that round and now it came in handy. Everyone saw Brando standing alone with his hands behind his back. Suddenly, a brilliant net of death appeared in the air. 2 to 3 Dragon Knight were caught off guard and crashed into it. They turned into ashes in the air. The rest of the dragon cavalry were frightened. They quickly flew higher, but even so, 2 of them had their wings and tails cut off by the golden red beam of light. They fell from the sky. Brendel ordered the wind spirit spiders to raise their shooting range even higher, and then activated another 20 to 30 holy swords. This time, the attack was even more accurate than before, and it was like a golden red longsword piercing through the dragon cavalry's formation. 6 or 7 dragon cavalry soldiers did not even have time to react before they were turned into ashes. The dragon cavalry soldiers of the Black Blade Squad were scared out of their wits. They did not dare to come any closer. Dozens of dragon cavalry circled in the air and ran away. However, Brando did not intend to let them go. He ordered the wind spirit spiders to chase after them until there were only 3 or 4 of them left. What a bunch of clowns. Brando could not help but shake his head. To be honest, he would not be afraid of these flies even if he did not have the holy swords. Erwin's dragon cavalry was considered a light air unit in Woen's air force. The light air force was usually used as a scouting unit. Even so, the dragon cavalry still had many limitations. Their ability to fight on the ground was also very worrisome. They also lacked the ability to fly in the canopy. To be honest, they were one of the worst air forces in Woen, second only to the goblins. He did not know where the dragon cavalry got the courage to attack. Did they really think that they were nobles' private soldiers? They did not even think about who had just defeated the White Lion Legion. He turned his head around. The private soldiers and officers who were entering the Frata forest were all silent. The scene just now was too exciting. A young and brave wizard challenging an army of demon kings alone. This was a scene that only happened in bedtime stories. Erwin's soldiers were naturally ignorant and inexperienced. They could not help but burst into cheers. Mr. Brando, isn't he the descendant of Lord Darius? How does he know magic? Princess Griffin could not help but ask in confusion. I've seen him use magic, the Wolf Knight shrugged, and he seems to know alchemy too. He's really versatile. However, we lack his previous 20 years of experience. Lord Swordmaster Darius lived in seclusion and was no different from a commoner. The royal family would not investigate a commoner, nor would they be able to. Everyone could not help but look at the young wizard on the side. The Shire quickly shook his head. Don't look at me. Actually, I met Lord Darius quite late. At least later than Miss Freya, but Lord Darius said that he was once a wizard's disciple, so there's nothing strange about it. Everyone could not help but reveal a look of understanding. However, they did not notice that Maynard frowned slightly. The female knight glanced at the Shire and did not seem to believe him. Although the attack of the dragon cavalry was repelled, it also confirmed Brando's previous concerns. He let his men disperse and enter the forest. In fact, he had this thought from the beginning. The dragon cavalry's ability to fly at low altitudes was very poor. It was difficult to find units hidden in the forest with the naked eye. Although it was not enough to completely shake off the enemy, it was at least much better than gathering together and being harassed by the enemy to the point where they could not move forward. Sure enough, once the young men of the Royal Knight Academy and Count Audine's private soldiers scattered into the forest, the dragon cavalry circling in the sky lost their target. They wanted to get closer to investigate, but they were immediately met with a counterattack from Brando's holy sword. They had no choice but to follow from a distance so as not to lose sight of the princess's target. This followed for 3 to 4 hours. After Brando finally repelled a low-altitude attack from the dragon cavalry, he stood beside a black pine tree and observed for a moment through the layers of treetops. After confirming that the other party had flown out of his attack range, he turned back. Almost everyone's eyes fell on him. The princess was fine. She sat quietly on a bluestone hugging her knees and was a little absent-minded. However, the eyes of the other young men were full of reverence. After experiencing the battle with the dragon cavalry, he had completely established his prestige, even in the eyes of the noble's private soldiers. However, Brando was well aware that the reason he could gain the recognition of these arrogant young men of the Royal Knight Academy was probably more because of his identity as the descendant of the sacred swordsman Darius. But to be honest, he did not really want this identity. It was not that he was a masochist who wanted to be a commoner, but because he already knew that the sacred swordsman Darius might have been tried by the Holy Cathedral for some reason. Brando also knew about the Holy Cathedral's trial. Most people would be skinned even if they did not die. However, his grandfather was safe in the end. It was probably because he had reached some kind of agreement with the Holy Cathedral. The Holy Cathedral might have done this to cover up the secret of the past. Of course, this was not important to Brando. What was important was that he, the descendant of the sacred swordsman Darius, was now swaggering in front of the public. Once the Holy Cathedral knew the truth, it was likely that they would come looking for trouble. At the thought of this, he could not help but have a headache. It was not easy for him to have a more prominent identity, and he did not have to deal with a lot of trouble before he could enjoy the benefits. Not only this, but the inheritance of the Dark Dragon was also the same. In fact, it was even more ridiculous. Not everyone in this world was like Orthless, who had experienced thousands of years and had a clear vision. It was even more likely that he would be hated by everyone. But now was not the time to worry about these things. Brando looked up, shook his head and sighed. The other party is very smart. No way. Enrique, the one with the best ending among Erwin's future 3 heroes, immediately replied with a smile. I think Sir can deal with them effortlessly. The dignified Wyvern Knight squad of the Black Blade squad can't do anything to us. When we enter the southern territory we will be free to fly. Brando looked at this guy as if he was looking at an idiot. He wondered if this guy was really one of the three heroes and if he had made a mistake. Could it be that the heavens were jealous of talents so idiots lived longer? Before he could finish his thoughts, Ruka patted Enrique's head. The leader of the three heroes quietly replied, "That's why I told you not to be distracted in class. Sir said that the Wyvern Knight squad has other plans. Don't forget that the Black Blade squad is still chasing after us." "Oh, I understand now." Enrique immediately reacted. "These guys want to delay us. They are really cunning. They did not hesitate to send their elites to their deaths. Even if they are not elites, they can't delay us." Mock snorted confidently. However, when he met Brando's smiling gaze, he could not help but blush and turn his head away. This detail naturally did not escape Enrique's observation. He immediately laughed and said, "Mr. Squire, I admire your wisdom." The future leader of the Royal Knight Squad of the kingdom, the white-haired Mr. Mock, who lost his bet with Brando and became his squire, was suddenly speechless. Brando looked at Enrique, the guy who wanted to see the world in chaos, and could not help but shake his head. This guy could not be Cargly's long-lost brother, right? So what should we do? Freya was the most serious among them. She looked at the map spread out on the ground and could not help but frown. "Brando, you have a plan, right?" There was indeed a plan. They definitely could not run forever. The key was to choose a suitable battlefield. The Black Blade squad used to be the Imperial Guard. In Brando's era, even after being weakened, they still had close to 50,000 people. In this era, the Black Blade squad was stronger than the Southern Legion. The Southern Legion had a regular strength of 70,000 people, so the Black Blade squad might have 100,000 people. Therefore, mobilizing tens of thousands of people to appear on the battlefield of Ampere Seal should not be too much of a problem. Coupled with the remnants of the White Lion Legion and various local troops, the military strength of the enemy was unbelievably huge. Adding up Austin's troops and the remnants of Danos' Southern Legion's Dragon Cavalry, they did not have more than 4,000 people at most. The disparity in strength between them and the enemy was a little ridiculous. Therefore he had to choose a special battlefield that was conducive to defense and where the enemy could not spread out. Fortunately, this was the Marchenko Mountains. In front of them was the Fama Mountains too. These two mountains were the northern branches of the Erech Mountains. In the game they were about level 25 to 30 areas. Brando was quite familiar with this area. Soon the name of the place appeared in his mind. He was about to speak, but it was at this moment that he felt something warm in his pocket. Brando hurriedly took it out. It was a black pearl. Brando immediately raised his eyebrows. A guest had arrived. This was truly an unexpected surprise. Noun explanation: sad face 1. In the literature records about Erewhon, the Erech Mountains were actually a geographical category that included many branches of the Erech Mountains. The Marchenko Mountains were located at the northernmost part of the northern branch of the Erech Mountains. It was the general name of the mountains surrounding the port of Ampere Seal to the south. 2. Fama Mountains, east and south of the Marchenko Mountains. It was the landmark where Ampere Seal entered the Erech Mountains. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.